They say a wolf dies alone, but what happens when the pack itself drives the alpha into exile? When the kingdom you bled to build becomes the weapon that destroys you? This is the story of King Vaelor Draven, a man who conquered empires, crushed rebellions, and built an iron throne on the bones of his enemies, until the day his own court decided he was too dangerous to survive. This isn't just another tale of power and betrayal. This is about what happens when the strongest man in the world discovers that strength means nothing when everyone you trusted wants you dead. Stay until the end. You're going to need to see how this plays out. And if this hits different, smash that like and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my tribe is watching from. The obsidian throne of Blackthorn Citadel had witnessed 1,000 executions. It had watched kingdoms fall. It had felt the weight of conquest crush entire bloodlines into dust beneath its carved armrests. But it had never felt empty. Not until tonight. Vaelor Draven stood alone in the throne room, his shadow stretching across black marble floors still stained with the blood of enemies who thought they could challenge him. The chandeliers above hung dark and silent. No guards lined the walls. No ministers whispered strategies in corners. No servants scurried between columns. Just silence. The kind of silence that screams. He ran his hand across the cold stone armrest, fingers tracing the grooves where his grip had worn the obsidian smooth over 10 years of ruling. 10 years of crushing rebellions before they could breathe. 10 years of turning noble houses into ash when they forgot their place. 10 years of being the nightmare that kept weaker men in line. And now those same men had decided the nightmare needed to end. His boots echoed through the empty hall as he walked toward the massive stained glass windows overlooking the capital. Below, the city sprawled like a sleeping beast. Thousands of lights flickering in the darkness, smoke rising from forges that never stopped burning, walls that stretched for miles, protecting the heart of an empire he carved out of chaos. His empire, built with blood, maintained with fear, perfected through absolute uncompromising dominance. The irony tasted like iron on his tongue. A door opened behind him. Soft footsteps approached with deliberate caution, the kind of careful movement prey makes when it knows the predator is watching. Vaelor didn't turn around. He already knew who it was. Lord Casimir Vale stepped into the dim light, his expensive robes rustling against the floor. The royal advisor. The man who had served at Vaelor's side since the beginning, who had helped architect the brutal systems that transformed a warlord into a king. His weathered face carried the exhausted expression of someone about to do something irreversible. They call it loyalty until the moment it becomes inconvenient. Casimir stopped 20 paces away. Professional distance, the gap between a servant and the man he was about to betray. Vaelor finally turned to face him. The advisor's hand trembled slightly at his side, fear and determination fighting for control of the same nervous system. That combination meant only one thing. Someone had promised him something worth risking everything. "You look tired, Casimir," Vaelor said quietly. His voice carried the same calm that had preceded every execution he'd ever ordered. "Guilty conscience weighing on you?" The older man's jaw tightened. "The council has made a decision." "The council?" Vaelor let the words hang in the air like smoke. "You mean the collection of frightened bureaucrats who hide behind protocol because they're terrified of actual combat? The realm requires stability. The realm requires strength." Vaelor's eyes locked onto him with surgical precision. "Which is why it survived this long. Because I gave it teeth when everyone else wanted to feed it scraps and hope nobody noticed it was starving." Casimir took a breath, steadying himself. This was the moment, the point of no return. "King Vaelor Draven," he said formally, each word feeling rehearsed. "By unanimous vote of the High Council, you are hereby relieved of your crown and authority. Effective immediately, you are stripped of all titles, lands, and protections afforded to the throne. The Council has determined that your methods have become a threat." Vaelor finished the sentence. "I've become a threat. To them. Not to the kingdom. To them." The advisor didn't deny it, because they both knew the truth. Vaelor had spent 10 years making himself indispensable, building an empire so dependent on his ruthlessness that removing him should have been impossible. But somewhere along the way, the fear he inspired stopped feeling like protection. It started feeling like a countdown. "There's a way through this that doesn't end in more bloodshed," Casimir said carefully. "Abdicate peacefully. Accept exile to the northern territories. You'll live comfortably, retain a modest fortune, and the kingdom transitions without a civil war, Vaelor said. That's what you're avoiding, because you know what happens if I fight this. Half the military still answers to me. The provincial lords fear the council less than they fear disappointing me. You're not removing a king. You're trying to dismantle a weapon without setting it off. Casimir's silence confirmed everything. Vaelor walked slowly toward him, each step measured and controlled. The older man's hand drifted instinctively toward the ceremonial blade at his waist, useless against someone who'd killed men with his bare hands before breakfast. But Vaelor stopped just outside striking distance. Up close, he could see the details. The sleepless nights carved into Casimir's face, the tremor in his hands that wasn't just age, the way his eyes kept darting toward the door like he expected assassins to emerge from the shadows at any moment. This wasn't a coup born from ambition. This was a coup born from terror. Who convinced you? Vaelor asked quietly. Which scared little nobleman whispered in your ear that I was planning to purge the council? That I was becoming unstable? That the kingdom would be safer under someone weaker? Casimir's throat worked. It doesn't matter. It does. Vaelor's voice dropped to something colder. Because whoever fed you that story is the same person who's going to gut you the moment I'm gone. You think removing me creates stability? It creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by whoever's ruthless enough to seize the moment. For just a second, doubt flickered across the advisor's face, then steel replaced it. The decision is made, Casimir said firmly. The royal guard has been reassigned. Your personal legions have been recalled to the capital under new command. The provincial governors have been informed. By sunrise, the transition will be complete. Vaelor studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that had preceded battlefield massacres. You're right, he said softly. The decision is made. You've torn apart the only thing holding this empire together. And now you get to watch what happens when you remove the predator, keeping worse things at bay. He turned and walked back toward the throne, his movements unhurried. Casimir watched him, confusion bleeding into his expression. You're accepting this? I'm acknowledging reality. Vaelor reached the throne but didn't sit. Instead, he ran his fingers along the carved obsidian one final time. You want me gone? Fine. I'm gone. But understand something, Casimir. I didn't build this empire on goodwill. I built it on consequences. And the thing about consequences... He looked back over his shoulder, eyes catching the dim light like a wolf's. They don't disappear just because you changed management. The door burst open. 6 royal guards in ceremonial armor flooded into the throne room, weapons drawn but held at a cautious ready. They spread out in formation, blocking the exits, their faces hidden behind steel visors that couldn't quite conceal their fear. Behind them walked Lady Seraphine Vael. Vaelor's entire body went still. She moved through the guards like she owned them, her dark green gown flowing against the black marble, silver embroidery catching the sparse light. Her expression was unreadable, the same controlled neutrality she'd worn since arriving at court 6 months ago as a political offering from the northern provinces. The daughter of the Vael bloodline, the last remnant of a royal house Vaelor had systematically dismantled during his rise to power. And now she stood in his throne room watching his empire crumble. Their eyes met. Vaelor had killed men for less disrespect than he saw in that gaze. The quiet defiance, the refusal to look away, the absolute absence of fear that should have been carved into every instinct she possessed. But there was something else there too, something he couldn't quite name. Casimir moved to stand beside her, suddenly looking more confident with armed guards backing his play. Lady Seraphine has agreed to serve as interim regent until a proper successor can be chosen through council vote. Of course she had. Vaelor's laugh was low and humorless. You're giving my throne to the daughter of the house I destroyed. That's poetic. Stupid, but poetic. Seraphine spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Your throne was never yours to keep. You took it through violence. Now it's being taken from you the same way. Except I'm still breathing, Vaelor said, which means you haven't taken anything yet. You've just delayed the inevitable. The inevitable, she repeated, is you walking out of this citadel tonight and never returning. That's the offer. That's the mercy you're being shown. Mercy. The word felt foreign in his mouth. I've executed people for less arrogance than what you're showing right now." She stepped forward, closing the distance between them with zero hesitation. The guards shifted nervously, hands tightening on weapons, but she waved them back with a small gesture. Now she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the pulse at her throat, the slight rise and fall of her breathing, the absolute absence of trembling in her hands. This woman had every reason to fear him, and she didn't. That alone made her dangerous. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Seraphine asked quietly. "I see a man who spent so long becoming a monster that he forgot what he was protecting. You didn't build an empire. You built a prison. And now the prisoners are tired of living in fear." Vaelor's jaw tightened. Fear is what kept them alive. Fear is what made them desperate enough to risk this. She gestured around the empty throne room. "You taught them to be terrified of you. Congratulations. Now they're more terrified of letting you continue than they are of removing you." The truth of that hit harder than any weapon, because she was right. He'd built his empire on one unshakable principle: be so dangerous that rebellion becomes unthinkable. Make the cost of defiance so catastrophically high that even considering it feels like suicide. But somewhere along the way, that calculation flipped. The cost of keeping him became higher than the cost of removing him. That's the paradox every tyrant eventually faces. The stronger you make yourself, the more threatening you become to the people depending on your strength. Casimir stepped forward, trying to regain control of the moment. "King Vaelor, we need your formal abdication. Sign the documents, and this ends peacefully. Refuse, and what?" Vaelor turned to face him fully. "You'll have your guards kill me? Here? In the throne room I built with the bones of better men than you?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. They'd fought beside him, bled beside him, watched him carve through enemy formations like a force of nature. And now they were supposed to execute him if he refused to walk away quietly. The cognitive dissonance was written across every visible piece of their body language. Casimir's hand moved toward a folded parchment inside his robes. "It doesn't have to be this way." Vaelor moved. Not violently, not aggressively, but fast enough that every guard in the room snapped to combat readiness. Weapons rising, feet shifting into defensive stances. He simply stepped forward and took the parchment from Casimir's trembling hands. The throne room held its breath. Vaelor unfolded the document slowly, reading the formal language of abdication, all the legal terminology designed to make betrayal sound like bureaucratic necessity, all the clauses ensuring his exile would be permanent, his wealth limited, his influence erased. They'd thought of everything, except one thing. He looked up at Seraphine, who watched him with those unreadable eyes. "You really think you can hold this kingdom together?" he asked. "I think I can hold it better than someone who rules through terror alone," she answered. "Terror works. Until it doesn't." She tilted her head slightly. "You proved that tonight." Silence stretched between them like a blade being drawn. Then Vaelor did something nobody expected. He laughed. Not the cold, humorless sound from before. This was genuine amusement, raw and unexpected, echoing through the throne room like thunder through empty halls. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, looking at Casimir, at Seraphine, at the guards standing between him and the exit. "You think removing me solves your problems. But I wasn't the problem. I was the solution, and now you get to discover what happens when the solution walks away." He threw the parchment to the floor unsigned. Casimir's face went white. "King Vaelor!" "I'm not your king anymore," Vaelor interrupted. "You made that very clear, so I'm making something clear right back. You want me gone? I'm gone. But I'm not signing your documents. I'm not legitimizing your coup. I'm not making this easy for you." He started walking toward the exit. The guards didn't move to stop him. They parted like water around a stone, creating a path through their formation without conscious thought. Muscle memory from 1,000 battles where getting in his way meant death. Seraphine's voice stopped him at the threshold. "Where will you go?" Vaelor paused, looking back over his shoulder one final time. The throne room looked smaller now, emptier, like something vital had been carved out of its center and discarded. "Somewhere you'll regret sending me," he answered. Then he walked into the darkness beyond the doorway and disappeared. 3 hours later, Vaelor stood on the eastern wall of Blackthorn Citadel, Watching the sun rise over the empire he no longer ruled. The wind cut through his traveling cloak, plain black fabric, unmarked by any royal insignia. Everything he owned now fit into a single pack slung over his shoulder, gold enough to survive, weapons enough to kill. Nothing else mattered. Below, the city was waking up, merchants opening shops, guards changing shifts, citizens moving through morning routines completely unaware that their king had been deposed overnight. By noon, the proclamations would go out. By sunset, the entire realm would know. By tomorrow, the vultures would start circling. A sound behind him made Vaelor turn. One of his former captains approached cautiously, Marcus Thorn, a scarred veteran who'd fought in every major campaign since the Empire's founding. He stopped a respectful distance away, studying Vaelor with the kind of assessment that comes from years of reading battlefield situations. "Heard what happened," Marcus said quietly. "Word travels fast. Always does when crowns change hands." The captain shifted his weight. "Half the military is confused as hell right now. They're being told you're abdicated, but nobody's seen you dead, and the orders contradict each other depending on which commander you ask." "Not my problem anymore." Marcus gave him a look that said he didn't believe that for a second. "You built this army, trained most of the senior officers personally. You really think they're going to follow some council that couldn't organize a stable rotation without your input?" Vaelor didn't answer, because the truth was complicated. Yes, the military was loyal to him, but loyalty is a resource that depletes when you're not actively reinforcing it. Give the council enough time, enough incentives, enough threats, and even the most faithful commanders would start falling in line with new management. That's how empires survived regime changes. The system adapted. The machine kept running. Individual pieces became replaceable. Even kings. "Where are you headed?" Marcus asked. "North," Vaelor said. "Beyond the Iron Veil. Somewhere the council's influence doesn't reach." "That's exile territory. Lawless. Brutal." "Good." Vaelor adjusted the pack on his shoulder. "I'm tired of pretending civilization matters." Marcus was quiet for a moment, weighing something internal. Then he made his decision. "Take me with you." Vaelor looked at him sharply. "You'd abandon your post? Your rank? Everything you've built here?" "I'd follow the only leader worth following." Marcus met his eyes without flinching. "This council? They're administrators playing at war. Give them 6 months and this empire collapses into factional infighting. I'd rather be in the wilderness with someone who knows how to survive than watching politicians destroy everything we bled for." Part of Vaelor wanted to refuse. Taking Marcus meant accepting responsibility for someone else's choices. It meant acknowledging that his exile wasn't truly solitary. It meant dragging a loyal soldier into consequences he didn't deserve. But another part of him, the part that had built an empire on recognizing useful assets, saw the strategic value. One loyal captain was worth more than a dozen uncertain allies. "Keep your mouth shut and your blade sharp," Vaelor said finally. "Where we're going, both matter more than rank." Marcus nodded once. "Understood." They left Blackthorn Citadel through a servant's gate in the eastern wall, slipping into the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts abandoning a haunted house. Behind them, the Empire began its transformation. Ahead of them, something far more dangerous waited. The northern territories beyond the Iron Veil were where civilization went to die. No roads, no governance, no law except what men carved out with violence and maintained through reputation. It was perfect. Vaelor and Marcus traveled for 6 days through increasingly hostile terrain, rocky highlands that gave way to dense forests, then frozen wastelands where the wind felt like knives against exposed skin. They passed through settlements that looked more like bandit camps, where survival was currency and weakness was a death sentence. Nobody recognized the former king. Out here, crowns meant nothing. Only strength mattered. And Vaelor had forgotten more about surviving than most of these frontier bastards would ever learn. On the 7th day, they reached a place called Ashmark. Calling it a town was generous. It was more like a collection of reinforced shelters clustered around a frozen river, surrounded by crude wooden walls designed to keep out predators, both animal and human. Smoke rose from chimneys. Armed men patrolled the perimeter with the casual alertness of people who'd killed before and expected to kill again. This was the kind of place where asking the wrong question got you buried in an unmarked grave. Vaelor liked it immediately. They entered through the main gate, where a guard with a crossbow and suspicious eyes looked them over. "State your business," he growled. "Looking for work," Vaelor said. "Heard there's coin for men who know how to fight." The guard spat into the snow. "Everyone here knows how to fight. Question is whether you know how to win." "Try me." Something in Vaelor's tone made the guard reconsider his attitude, that subtle shift in body language that predators recognize in each other. The way a wolf knows not to challenge another wolf unless it's prepared for consequences. He stepped aside. "Talk to K.L. Blackwater. Runs operations out of the longhouse past the market. He'll decide if you're worth keeping alive." They walked into Ashmark proper. The settlement was exactly what Vaelor expected. Rough, functional, and completely indifferent to anything resembling civilization. The market was a scattering of stalls selling salvaged weapons, preserved food, and information. The people moved with the efficient wariness of survivors, eyes constantly scanning for threats, hands never far from blades. This wasn't a community, this was a pack, and Vaelor understood packs. The longhouse dominated the center of Ashmark, a massive structure built from blackwood logs and reinforced with iron plating. Smoke poured from vents along the roof. Voices carried through the walls, rough and argumentative. Inside, the air was thick with heat from a central fire pit. Tables lined the space, occupied by men and women who looked like they'd been forged in the same brutal crucible that shaped the frontier. Scars, weapons, eyes that had seen too much death to pretend otherwise. At the far end sat a man who could only be K.L. Blackwater. Massive, scarred across half his face, built like someone who'd spent his entire life fighting for every breath. He was armored even indoors, plate mail marked with dents and scratches that told stories of survival. He looked up as Vaelor approached, eyes narrowing in assessment. Vaelor stopped in front of him and waited. Silence spread through the longhouse as conversations died. Everyone was watching now, evaluating the newcomer, deciding whether he was prey or predator. K.L. leaned back in his chair, studying Vaelor with the kind of thoroughness that came from years of judging threats. "You got a name?" he asked, voice like gravel. "Draven," Vaelor answered. "First name only, no titles, no history." "Draven." K.L. tasted the word. "You looking for trouble or trying to avoid it?" "Looking for work. Trouble's optional." A few of the nearby fighters chuckled. K.L. didn't smile. "Work means loyalty. You betray me, I kill you. You lie to me, I kill you. You put this settlement at risk through stupidity or cowardice, I kill you. We clear?" "Crystal." "Good." K.L. gestured toward an empty seat. "Sit. Tell me what makes you worth keeping." Vaelor sat. Marcus stood behind him, silent and watchful. "I've led men," Vaelor said. "Fought in wars you've probably heard about and a few you haven't. I know tactics, strategy, and how to win when the odds look impossible." "Everyone here knows how to fight," K.L. said, echoing the guard's earlier sentiment. "What makes you different?" Vaelor met his eyes directly. "I don't lose." The simplicity of it hung in the air. No elaboration, no bragging, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that either came from delusion or experience. K.L. studied him for a long moment. Then he stood. "Prove it." The fighting pit behind the longhouse was a circular depression in the frozen ground, surrounded by crude wooden barriers. Torches burned along the perimeter, casting flickering shadows across snow-packed earth. Word spread fast. Within minutes, half of Ashmark had gathered to watch. Fighting was entertainment here. Blood was currency. And newcomers always had to prove themselves the hard way. Vaelor stood in the center of the pit, unarmed. Across from him stood a man twice his width, a brute named Gareth, who'd apparently won the last 17 pit fights without losing. Muscle like a bear, scars like a battlefield map, eyes that had long stopped seeing opponents as human. K.L. watched from the edge, arms crossed. "First blood," he called out, "or submission. Killing's discouraged, but not forbidden." Gareth cracked his knuckles, grinning. "Haven't killed anyone in 3 fights. You gonna break my streak?" Vaelor didn't answer. He just watched, studying movement patterns. Weight distribution. The slight favor of Gareth's left leg that suggested an old injury never fully healed. The brute charged. fast for someone that size, closing the distance in 3 powerful strides, fist swinging toward Vaelor's skull with enough force to shatter bone. Vaelor moved, not backward, not to the side. Forward. Inside the arc of Gareth's punch, too close for the bigger man's strength to generate full momentum. His elbow drove upward into the brute's solar plexus, precise, brutal, perfectly timed. Air exploded from Gareth's lungs. Before he could recover, Vaelor's knee slammed into his thigh, right where that old injury weakened his stance. The leg buckled. Gareth stumbled, balance shattered. Then Vaelor's fist crashed into his temple. The brute dropped like a felled tree. Silence. Total absolute silence from the crowd. Gareth lay in the snow, breathing but unconscious, the entire fight lasting less than 10 seconds from start to finish. Vaelor straightened, barely winded, and looked at Kael. Good enough? The settlement leader stared at him, reassessing everything. Then slowly a smile spread across his scarred face. Welcome to Ashmark, Kael said. Looks like we just found ourselves a new combat instructor. Vaelor nodded once, and just like that, the former King Alpha became a frontier mercenary. 3 weeks passed. Vaelor integrated into Ashmark's brutal ecosystem with disturbing ease. He trained fighters, led raids against rival settlements, established defensive strategies that turned the crude wooden walls into something approaching actual fortification. The people of Ashmark didn't know they were being led by a deposed king. They just knew that this stranger called Draven was the most dangerous man they'd ever met. Marcus served as his second, handling logistics and recruitment while Vaelor focused on combat operations. Together they transformed a loose collection of violent survivors into something approaching an organized force. Kael noticed. You've done this before, he said one night, watching Vaelor coordinate a perimeter expansion. This isn't your first time building from nothing. Vaelor didn't confirm or deny. You wanted better defenses. I'm giving you better defenses. I'm not complaining, Kael said carefully. But I know command when I see it. You weren't just a soldier. You led armies. Past tense. Why? The question hung between them. Vaelor could have lied, could have fabricated some story about a fallen mercenary company or a disgraced military career, but something in Kael's tone suggested the man already suspected pieces of the truth. I made enemies, Vaelor said finally. Powerful ones. They wanted me gone. So here I am. Kael absorbed that. These enemies coming after you? Eventually. Should I be worried? Vaelor looked at him directly. Depends. You loyal to your people or to your comfort? My people, Kael answered without hesitation. Then you've got nothing to worry about, Vaelor said. When trouble comes, we'll handle it the same way we handle everything else here, with violence and strategy. Kael nodded slowly. Fair enough. But that night, lying in the rough barracks Ashmark called housing, Vaelor stared at the wooden ceiling and felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. Because he knew the truth. The council wouldn't just let him disappear. Exiled kings were dangerous, living symbols of alternative power structures, walking reminders that current authority was neither permanent nor inevitable. They'd send someone, not immediately. They'd wait until they thought he was settled, vulnerable, disconnected from his former resources. Then they'd try to finish what they started. The only question was when. The answer came 6 days later. Vaelor was overseeing morning drills when Marcus appeared at his side, expression grim. We've got movement, the captain said quietly. Riders approaching from the south, military formation, flying imperial colors. Vaelor's jaw tightened. Here it comes. They watched from the walls as the column approached. 20 armored soldiers, professional and disciplined, led by a figure Vaelor recognized even from a distance. Commander Lyanna Frost, one of his own former officers, a woman he'd personally promoted 3 years ago after she'd held a mountain pass against impossible odds. Brilliant tactician, ruthless when necessary, loyal, or so he'd thought. The column stopped just outside arrow range. Lyanna rode forward alone, stopping at speaking distance. She removed her helmet, revealing sharp features and cold eyes that had seen too many battlefields. King Vaelor, she called out formally. The title echoed across the frozen ground like an accusation. Every fighter in Ashmark turned to stare at Vaelor, their combat instructor, their strategic advisor, their mysterious stranger with skills that didn't match his story, their deposed king. Vaelor walked to the edge of the wall, looking down at his former commander. "Wrong title," he said. "I'm not a king anymore. You made sure of that." Lyanna's expression didn't change. "The council sent me to deliver a message." "I'm listening." "Return to the capital. Face trial for crimes against the realm. Accept judgment. If you comply, clemency might be considered." Vaelor laughed, dark and humorless. "Crimes against the realm," he repeated. "What crimes? Building an empire, crushing rebellions, giving you people a kingdom worth protecting? Excessive violence, unauthorized executions, abuse of power." Lyanna listed them mechanically. "The council has evidence, testimonies, documents, all conveniently appearing after I'm gone," Vaelor said. "Tell me, Lyanna, how much did they pay you to betray someone who saved your life?" For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Shame, conflict, the ghost of loyalty fighting against present necessity. Then it vanished behind professional neutrality. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's always personal," Vaelor shot back. "You don't get to pretend politics erases history. I pulled you out of that pass when your entire unit was being slaughtered. I promoted you over senior officers who'd been waiting years. I trusted you with command when everyone else said you were too young. And I'm grateful. Gratitude doesn't march 20 soldiers to my doorstep demanding surrender." Silence fell between them. The Ashmark fighters watched with predatory interest. They didn't know the full story, but they understood betrayal. It was currency in the frontier, and right now they were watching someone collect a debt. Lyanna straightened in her saddle. "You have until sunset to make a decision. Return peacefully, or we take you by force." "With 20 soldiers?" Vaelor's smile was sharp. "Against an entire settlement that's been training under my command for a month? Your tactical assessment skills have deteriorated, Commander." "These 20 are just the vanguard," Lyanna said. 200 more are camped 5 miles south. If you resist, they'll burn Ashmark to the ground, and everyone in it." The threat hung in the frozen air. Kale appeared beside Vaelor on the wall, eyes hard. "That true?" "Probably," Vaelor admitted. "Then what do we do?" Vaelor looked at the settlement leader, then back at Lyanna, then at the fighters watching from below. These people had given him refuge, accepted him without demanding his past, built something approaching trust in a place where trust was worth more than gold, and now his presence was putting them at risk. That's the cost of being king. Even in exile, even stripped of power, the crown's shadow follows. Consequences ripple outward, catching innocent people in their wake. He could surrender. Walk down there. Let Lyanna take him back to face whatever show trial the council had prepared. Save Ashmark from becoming collateral damage in someone else's political game. Or he could fight. Turn this frozen settlement into a battlefield. Teach the council that removing a king and killing a king were very different propositions. Prove that exile hadn't dulled any of the dangerous edges that made him terrifying in the first place. Both options carried costs. Both demanded sacrifices, and both would change everything. Vaelor made his choice. He turned to Kael. "Evacuate non-combatants to the northern caves," he said quietly. "Anyone who can't fight needs to disappear before sunset. The council's coming regardless of what I do. Better to face them without civilians caught in the middle." Kael nodded grimly. "And the fighters?" "Give them a choice. Stand with me or get out. But make sure they understand this isn't their fight. This is mine. Anyone who stays does it because they choose to, not because I asked." "What about you?" Vaelor looked back at Lyanna, still waiting for an answer. "I'm done running," he said. Then he called down to his former commander. "Tell the council I have a counteroffer. They leave Ashmark alone, and I'll give them the war they're clearly looking for, but it won't be on their terms. It'll be on mine." Lyanna's face hardened. "That's your final answer?" "That's my only answer." For a moment, the commander looked like she wanted to say something else, something personal, something that acknowledged the history between them. But professionalism won. She replaced her helmet, turned her horse, and rode back to the waiting column. Within minutes, they disappeared back toward the south, toward the army waiting 5 miles away, toward a confrontation that would decide whether a deposed king could survive becoming a warlord. Kael watched them go, then looked at Vaelor. "You just declared war on an empire," he said. "No," Vaelor corrected. "I declared war on the people who stole it from me." "That's the same thing." "Not even close." Below, Ashmark erupted into controlled chaos as fighters scrambled to prepare defenses. Weapons were distributed. Barricades reinforced. Scouts sent out to track the approaching force. Marcus appeared at Vaelor's shoulder, expression unreadable. "This is it then," the captain said quietly. "No more exile. No more hiding. We're going loud." "We were always going loud," Vaelor answered. "They just forced the timeline. The fighters are asking questions, want to know why an imperial army is hunting you, want to know who you really are." Vaelor was quiet for a moment. Then he made a decision. "Gather everyone," he said. "Everyone who's staying. I owe them the truth before asking them to die for it." An hour later, every fighter in Ashmark stood in the Longhouse. Roughly 40 men and women, veterans of frontier violence, survivors of the kind of brutality that made imperial politics look like children's games. They watched Vaelor with suspicion, curiosity, and something approaching respect. He stood before them, unarmed, meeting their eyes without flinching. "My name is Vaelor Draven," he began. "Until 6 weeks ago, I was king of Varathon. I built an empire from burning kingdoms and shattered bloodlines. I ruled through fear, violence, and absolute control. And then my own council decided I was too dangerous to keep alive." Silence. Total, absolute silence. "They stripped my crown, exiled me, sent me into the frontier to disappear quietly while they divided up the power I left behind. That should have been the end of it. I should have stayed hidden, built a new life, accepted that some battles aren't worth fighting." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "But they couldn't leave it alone. They're sending an army to kill me. And because I'm here, that army is coming to kill you too. So you have a choice. Leave now, tonight, before the fighting starts. No judgment, no shame. This isn't your war." Nobody moved. Vaelor continued. "Or stay. Help me teach these imperial bastards what happens when you try to erase someone who built their entire existence on not being erasable. Fight beside a deposed king who has absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to prove." A fighter near the back spoke up, a woman named Sarah with scars across her knuckles and violence in her eyes. "What do we get out of this?" "Survival," Vaelor said bluntly. "Victory. And if we're very lucky, a piece of an empire that's about to tear itself apart. That's not much of a guarantee." "No," Vaelor agreed. "It's not. But I'll tell you what I can guarantee. I know how to win against impossible odds. I know how the imperial military thinks because I built it. I know their weaknesses because I created them. And I know that if we break this army, the council's authority shatters." He let that sink in. "They're coming here expecting to crush a frontier settlement. Instead, they're walking into a trap set by the man who taught them how to fight in the first place." Kyle stepped forward. "How many are we facing?" 200 trained soldiers, professional equipment, standard siege tactics. Against 40 of us. 40 of us who know this terrain, who've survived worse than imperial discipline, who don't fight for politics or promotion. We fight because dying isn't acceptable." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Vaelor raised his voice slightly. "I'm not asking you to die for me. I'm offering you a chance to matter, to be part of something bigger than survival. Because when this is over, when the dust settles and the council realizes they can't kill me quietly, the entire empire is going to fracture. Provincial lords will choose sides. Military commanders will split loyalties. And the people standing with me right now will be positioned to claim pieces of what's coming." It was brutal honesty. No noble speeches, no appeals to honor or justice, just the raw calculation of violence, survival, and opportunity. The frontier understood that language. Sarah looked around at her fellow fighters, then back at Vaelor. "I'm in," she said. One by one, others echoed the sentiment. Not everyone. 3 fighters left immediately, disappearing into the night to avoid the coming storm. But 37 stayed. 37 against 200. Kael approached Vaelor after the crowd dispersed. "This is insane," he said quietly. "Probably. We're going to die." "Maybe. And you're okay with that?" Vaelor looked at him directly. "I spent 10 years ruling an empire built on the corpses of people who underestimated me. The council thinks exile made me weak. They think removing my crown removed my teeth. They're about to learn that kingship was never the source of my power. Then what was? Vaelor smiled, cold and sharp. I was Besek. They had 18 hours before the Imperial army arrived. Vaelor spent every minute of it transforming Ashmark from a settlement into a killing field. The wooden walls became secondary defenses. The real traps waited beyond them, concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes, tripwires connected to deadfalls, frozen sections of ground deliberately weakened to collapse under armored weight. He divided the fighters into 3 groups. Ranged attackers positioned on rooftops and elevated platforms with clear firing lanes. Melee specialists hidden in structures near choke points where superior numbers became a disadvantage. Mobile reserves ready to exploit weaknesses as they appeared. Standard tactics for asymmetric warfare, but executed with the precision of someone who'd won battles against worse odds. Marcus coordinated logistics, arrows, weapons, medical supplies, positioned strategically throughout the settlement. Everything designed for maximum efficiency under combat conditions. Kyle handled morale, moving between fighters with the confidence of a leader who'd survived enough frontier violence to understand what his people needed to hear. And Vaelor watched it all come together with grim satisfaction. This was what he was built for. Not ceremonies, not political maneuvering, not the empty theatrics of courtly power. Combat. Pure, brutal, unforgiving combat, where survival belonged to whoever wanted it most. The sun set. Darkness swallowed Ashmark. Torches burned along the walls, controlled and strategic, providing just enough light to see approaching threats without blinding the defenders. Then they waited. Vaelor stood on the eastern wall, Marcus beside him, both scanning the frozen darkness beyond the settlement. Think they'll attack tonight? Marcus asked. No, Vaelor said. Lyanna's too smart for that. She knows night attacks against fortified positions favor defenders. She'll wait for dawn, use daylight to assess our defenses, probe for weaknesses before committing to full assault. You trained her well. I trained all of them well, that's the problem. But as midnight approached, Vaelor felt something shift, a change in the air, a subtle wrongness that combat instincts recognized before conscious thought caught up. Then he saw them. Not soldiers. Fire. Dozens of burning arrows arcing through the darkness, trailing flames like falling stars, slamming into Ashmark's wooden structures with devastating precision. Fire! Someone screamed. Chaos erupted. Fighters scrambled to combat the flames spreading across buildings. Water, snow, anything to stop the conflagration before it consumed the entire settlement. And in that moment of distraction, the real attack began. The Imperial army didn't wait for dawn. They used the fire as cover, advancing under the chaos, exploiting the exact moment when Ashmark's defenders were divided between fighting flames and watching for threats. Vaelor saw it happening and felt something cold settle into his chest. Lyanna had learned from him too well. She'd anticipated his defensive strategy, used his own tactics against him, created chaos to mask the real assault. "North Wall!" he roared. "They're coming from the north!" But it was too late. The first wave of Imperial soldiers hit the northern defenses like a steel tsunami, crashing through weakened sections with brutal efficiency. Fighting exploded throughout Ashmark. Vaelor drew his blade and moved, not toward the fire, not toward the obvious threat, toward the place where Lyanna would position herself. Because he knew her. Knew how she thought. Knew that a commander worth following led from the front, not the rear. And there she was. Fighting through the northern breach, cutting down defenders with professional precision, her armor reflecting firelight like a demon emerging from hell itself. Their eyes met across 20 yards of burning chaos, recognition, anger, and something that might have been regret. Then they moved toward each other through the battlefield carnage, former king and former protege, ready to settle what words couldn't resolve. But before they could close the distance, an explosion, massive, catastrophic. The western wall detonated in a fireball that turned night into day, throwing fighters in every direction, collapsing structures and shattering what remained of Ashmark's defensive coherence. Vaelor hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision swimming. Through the smoke and flames, he saw shapes moving. Not Imperial soldiers, something else. Figures in black armor marked with a sigil he recognized instantly. The Mordrake crest. Lucian Mordrake, The warlord he'd exiled years ago. The enemy who'd vanished into the eastern wastelands promising vengeance. He was here, and he'd brought his own army, not to save Vaelor, to finish what the council started. Marcus appeared through the smoke, bleeding from a head wound, pulling Vaelor to his feet. "We need to go!" the captain shouted over the roar of combat. "Where? Anywhere but here!" But there was nowhere to go. Imperial soldiers pouring through the northern breach, Mordrake's forces advancing from the west. Fire consuming everything. Ashmark's defenders scattered, overwhelmed, dying. Vaelor had walked into a trap. Not the council's trap. A much more elaborate one. And as he stood in the center of burning chaos, watching his temporary refuge collapse into massacre, one thought crystallized with brutal clarity. This wasn't about removing a deposed king. This was about erasing him completely. And someone very powerful had just revealed their hand. The thing about surviving an impossible situation is that survival stops being the goal. It becomes the weapon. Vaelor understood that in the seconds before Marcus dragged him toward the only exit that hadn't collapsed into flames, the eastern gate, barely standing, half consumed by fire, but still navigable if they moved fast enough. Behind them, Ashmark was dying. Not just burning. Dying. The settlement that had given him refuge was being systematically dismantled by two armies who'd apparently coordinated their assault with terrifying precision. Imperial soldiers securing the northern sections, Mordrake's forces claiming the west. And somewhere in the chaos between them, Ashmark's fighters were being crushed like insects caught between grinding stones. This wasn't strategy. This was annihilation. Marcus shoved Vaelor through the gate, both of them stumbling into frozen darkness beyond the walls. Behind them, screams mixed with the roar of flames and the clash of steel. The sounds of a massacre happening in real time. Vaelor's instinct was to turn back, to fight, to die with the people who'd chosen to stand beside him, to prove that even without a crown, he was still the most dangerous thing on any battlefield. But Marcus grabbed his arm with iron grip, not pleading, not afraid, just absolutely certain. "You don't waste survival," the captain's expression said. "You weaponize it." They ran, through frozen forest, over rocky terrain that tried to break ankles with every step, away from the burning settlement and toward the kind of darkness that either swallows you whole or becomes your shield. Vaelor could still hear the fighting behind them, growing distant but never quite disappearing. A reminder that choices carry consequences that echo long after you've stopped paying attention. He'd brought war to Ashmark, and Ashmark had paid the price. That's what power does when it goes into exile. It doesn't disappear, it just destroys different people. They ran until exhaustion forced them to stop, miles beyond the settlement, deep in wilderness that looked identical in every direction. Trees, snow, darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. Marcus collapsed against a boulder, breathing hard, blood still trickling from the head wound he'd taken during the explosion. Vaelor stood motionless, staring back toward where Ashmark burned on the horizon. Orange glow against black sky. Beautiful and terrible. A funeral pyre for people who'd trusted the wrong stranger. His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from rage so pure it felt like poison flooding his system. Someone had orchestrated this. The council's attack, Mordrake's appearance, the timing, the coordination. None of it was accident. Someone had pulled strings, moved pieces, turned his exile into an execution, and they'd miscalculated exactly one thing. They hadn't killed him yet. Marcus finally caught his breath enough to speak. "We need to keep moving. They'll send trackers." "Let them," Vaelor said quietly. "That's suicide." "No, that's evolution." He turned to face his captain. "They wanted me gone because I was dangerous with an empire behind me. Now they're going to discover what I become with nothing left to lose." Marcus studied him in the darkness, reading body language, assessing threat levels, making calculations about whether his commander had finally broken or was transforming into something worse. "What's the play?" the captain asked. Vaelor smiled, cold, sharp, absolutely devoid of anything resembling mercy. "We find out who gave Mordrake Imperial coordination. We kill everyone involved, and then we burn their empire to the ground while they watch." It wasn't a plan. It was a declaration of intent. Marcus nodded slowly. Going to need resources, intel, people we can trust. We'll start with people who hate the council as much as I do. Vaelor began moving through the forest, every step deliberate now, purpose replacing panic. The provincial lords, the military commanders I promoted, everyone who built their power on my foundation and watched it get torn away. You think they'll help? I think they'll recognize opportunity when it's covered in blood and looking for revenge. They walk through the night, not running anymore, not fleeing, hunting. Because that's what predators do when they stop pretending to be civilized. They remember what they were built for. They shed the performance of restraint, and they teach the world why fear was never just theater. It was prophecy. 3 days of forced march through hostile wilderness brought them to the border of the Iron Vale territories. This was neutral ground, technically. The kind of neutral that meant nobody officially controlled it, but everyone with enough violence could claim temporary ownership. They emerged from tree cover to find a trade road, barely maintained, mostly used by smugglers and mercenaries who understood that legitimate commerce had better routes. A wagon sat abandoned near the roadside, overturned, scorch marks, blood in the snow, recent attack, maybe hours old. Marcus approached cautiously, scanning for threats. Bandits? Worse, Vaelor said, studying the pattern. Professional. Look at the kill zones, the positioning. This was military. Imperial? Maybe. Or someone using Imperial tactics. He crouched beside the wagon, examining the cargo scattered across frozen ground. Weapons, medicine, supplies marked with Merchant Guild insignias. They were transporting to somewhere important, got intercepted before arrival. Movement in the trees. Both men spun, weapons rising. A figure stepped into view. Young woman, maybe 20, wearing armor that had seen combat recently. Blood on her sleeve. Exhaustion carved into every line of her body. She held a blade, but her grip was weak. Survivor. Her eyes went wide when she saw them. Please, she gasped. I don't have anything worth... Relax, Vaelor interrupted. We're not bandits. She looked them over. 2 men, armed, moving through wilderness like they owned it. Her skepticism was written across her face. Then what are you? Travelers, Marcus said. Same as you. Travelers don't move like predators. Vaelor smiled slightly. Sharp kid. What happened to your caravan? She hesitated. Trust was currency out here, information even more so. Giving either to strangers was usually how you ended up dead in a ditch. But desperation makes people take risks. Imperial soldiers, she said finally. Ambushed us 6 hours ago, killed everyone except me, took our cargo and left. Why'd they leave you alive? Her jaw tightened. I hid, like a coward. You survived, Vaelor corrected. That's not cowardice. That's tactics. She looked at him with something approaching surprise, like she'd expected judgment instead of understanding. Where were you headed? Marcus asked. Ironhearth, she said. Settlement about 20 miles northeast. We were bringing supplies, medical, weapons. They're preparing for... She stopped, suddenly wary. For what? Vaelor pressed. Why do you care? Because Imperial soldiers attacking supply lines means someone's trying to isolate a target. He stepped closer, voice dropping. And targets worth isolating are usually targets worth protecting. The woman studied him, really studied him, trying to figure out what kind of threat he represented, whether helping him would get her killed faster than staying silent. Finally, she made her choice. Ironhearth is gathering resistance, she said quietly. Provincial lords, displaced military. People who think the council's rule is illegitimate. Vaelor felt something click into place. Illegitimate why? Because they deposed King Vaelor without legal authority. Because they're consolidating power through fear instead of governance. Because, she paused, searching his face. Because some people think the old king, for all his brutality, at least provided stability. Marcus shot Vaelor a look. The woman continued, oblivious. Ironheart's been organizing for weeks, trying to build coalition. But if the council's cutting supply lines, they might not have enough resources to hold out when the real assault comes. How many fighters? Vaelor asked. Maybe 300, mix of veterans and motivated civilians. Against? Unknown. But the council's not stupid. They'll send overwhelming force. Vaelor was quiet for a moment, calculating. 300 fighters, organized resistance, legitimate grievance against the council, all the ingredients for either revolution or massacre, depending on who led them, and they were being systematically isolated. You have a name? He asked the woman. Kira. Kira, I need you to take us to Ironhearth. She laughed, bitter and exhausted. Why would I do that? Because I can help them survive what's coming. You're 2 men. What difference could you possibly make? Vaelor met her eyes directly. I've won battles against worse odds with fewer people, and I have extremely personal reasons for wanting the council to suffer. Something in his tone made her reconsider, that edge of absolute certainty that comes from experience, not bravado. Who are you? She asked. Someone who knows exactly how Imperial military thinks, he answered, because I built it. Understanding dawned across her face, slowly, like watching sunrise break over hostile territory. No, she whispered. You're coming with you to Ironhearth, Vaelor interrupted, or walking away and letting them die without proper leadership. Your choice. Kira stared at him. The deposed king. The nightmare the council couldn't fully erase, standing in front of her covered in ash and blood, offering to be the weapon her people desperately needed. She should have said no, should have run, should have understood that accepting help from someone this dangerous meant becoming collateral damage in a war that had nothing to do with her. But desperation makes people gamble on long shots. Follow me, she said. Ironhearth wasn't a settlement. It was a fortress pretending to be a village, nestled in a valley between mountains surrounded by natural defenses and deliberately limited access points. The buildings were stone instead of wood. The walls were reinforced. The population moved with military discipline barely disguised as civilian routine. Someone had been planning this for a while. Guards stopped them at the outer perimeter, armed, professional, watching Vaelor and Marcus with the kind of suspicion earned through experience. Kira spoke quickly. These men help me. They want to meet with the leadership. Leadership's busy, one guard said flatly. Make them unbusy, Vaelor said. Unless you want to explain why you turned away someone who can keep this place from becoming a mass grave. The guard's hand moved toward his weapon. That a threat? That's a professional assessment from someone who's defended more fortifications than you've probably seen. Vaelor's tone stayed level. I'm offering help. You're offering posturing. One of us is wasting time we don't have. The guards exchanged looks. Then one disappeared into the settlement while the other kept watch, clearly unconvinced but willing to defer to higher authority. 20 minutes later, they were escorted through Ironhearth's interior. Vaelor cataloged everything. Defensive positions, weapon stores, fighter distribution. The settlement was well organized but stretched thin. 300 fighters spread across too much territory, not enough redundancy in critical positions. They could hold against standard assault, but not against what the council would actually send. The command center was built into a repurposed grain house. Thick walls, limited access points, elevated position giving tactical overview of surrounding terrain. Inside a handful of people stood around a table covered in maps and reports. And at the head of that table stood someone Vaelor recognized immediately. Lord David Crane, former provincial governor. Brilliant administrator. One of the few nobles Vaelor had actually respected during his reign because the man understood that governance required both intelligence and spine. Davith looked up as they entered. His expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and complete shock in approximately 3 seconds. Gods, he breathed. Just Vaelor, the former king corrected. The gods stopped answering when I needed them most. Silence crashed through the command center. Everyone stared. The deposed king, the ghost who was supposed to have disappeared into exile, standing in their headquarters covered in road dirt and looking every inch the predator he'd always been. Davith recovered first, years of political survival teaching him to adapt faster than shock allowed. Clear the room, he ordered. The others hesitated until he repeated it with authority. Then they filed out, casting backward glances at Vaelor like he might vanish if they looked away. Once they were alone, just Davith, Vaelor, Marcus, and Kira, the Lord approached slowly, They said you were exiled, dead according to some rumors. Exile, Vaelor confirmed. Death still pending. What are you doing here? Surviving, same as you, apparently. Davith's jaw tightened. This isn't just survival. This is resistance, Vaelor finished. I know, Kira explained. The Lord shot the young woman a look. She shrugged defensively. He recognized Imperial tactics, she said, offered to help. Help? Davith turned back to Vaelor. The last time you helped anyone, you conquered half the continent, and built an empire stable enough that removing me required a conspiracy instead of an honest challenge. Vaelor moved to the table, studying the maps. You're organizing provincial resistance against the Council. How's that working out? We have 300 committed fighters, more arriving daily, support from 6 provincial territories, resources to hold out for 2 weeks, Vaelor interrupted, reading the supply charts. Maybe 3 if you ration aggressively. Then what? Davith's silence confirmed the assessment. Vaelor continued. The Council knows you're here. They're cutting your supply lines, isolating you systematically. When you're weak enough, they'll send overwhelming force and crush this before it becomes actual revolution. We know the risks. Do you? Vaelor looked up. Because from where I'm standing, you're playing at rebellion without understanding the first rule of insurgency. You don't fight Empire head-on, you make Empire fight itself. And you're offering what? Your expertise? I'm offering the only thing that matters anymore, Vaelor said. I'm offering to win. Davith studied him, really studied him, trying to figure out if this was opportunity or trap. Why? He asked finally. Why would you help us? Because the Council tried to kill me 3 days ago, Vaelor said flatly, burned an entire settlement to get at me, coordinated with enemies I thought were long gone, made it very clear that exile wasn't enough. They want me erased. So this is revenge. This is survival, Vaelor corrected. Revenge is just the method. Marcus spoke up for the first time. The king knows Imperial military better than anyone alive. He built it, trained it, knows every weakness because he created most of them. You want to survive what's coming, you need someone who understands how they think. Davith looked between them, calculating, weighing risks against potential gains, understanding that accepting Vaelor's help meant becoming part of whatever brutal endgame the former king was orchestrating, but also understanding that refusing might mean watching Ironhearth burn. If you help us, Davith said carefully, what do you want in return? Vaelor smiled, cold and sharp. I want the Council to understand they made a mistake, he said. I want every nobleman who supported my exile to regret it. And when this is over, I want the Empire to remember that killing a king requires actually finishing the job. It wasn't reassuring, it was terrifying, but Davith had spent enough time in Vaelor's court to recognize honesty when he heard it. You have 1 week to prove you're worth the risk, the Lord said finally. After that, we reassess. Fair enough. And Vaelor? Davith's expression hardened. If you betray us, if this is some elaborate council trap, I'll kill you myself. Vaelor extended his hand. Davith took it. The deal was made, and Ironhearth just became the opening move in a war the council didn't know was starting. The first thing Vaelor did was completely reorganize their defensive strategy. He spent 18 hours walking every inch of Ironhearth's perimeter, studying sight lines, testing weak points, identifying where professional attackers would focus their assault. Then he tore apart everything they'd built. Your walls are suicide, Bisham, he told Davith bluntly during their first strategy session. You're defending static positions against an enemy that will use siege tactics and overwhelming firepower. The moment they breach, and they will breach, you're trapped. We've reinforced Reinforcement doesn't matter when the strategy is fundamentally flawed. Vaelor pointed to the maps. You're thinking like administrators. Protect the center, hold the walls, make them pay for every inch. That works against bandits. Against Imperial military, it's a death sentence. One of Davith's advisors bristled. And what would you suggest? Surrender? I'd suggest understanding that defense isn't about holding ground, Vaelor said. It's about making the attack cost more than it's worth. He began marking the maps. Here, and here. These are where they'll stage their assault. Natural approach. Good sight lines for their forces. Terrible for us if we're sitting behind walls waiting. So we abandon the walls? Another advisor asked skeptically. No. We bait them. Vaelor's finger traced movement patterns. Make the walls look defended, just enough presence to draw their attention. Meanwhile, real force positions here. He marked locations outside the settlement, in terrain that breaks up their formation. Force them to fight on ground that favors smaller numbers. That's guerrilla tactics, Davith said. That's how you win when you're outnumbered. Vaelor looked up. You wanted my expertise. This is it. Stop fighting like you have resources you don't possess. Start fighting like you have nothing to lose. The shift in thinking was uncomfortable. These were people trained to value stability, order. The idea of intentionally creating chaos went against every instinct. But Vaelor had built an empire on understanding that sometimes chaos was the only weapon that mattered. Over the next 3 days, Ironhearth transformed. Fighters trained in mobile tactics instead of static defense. Supplies moved from central storage to distributed caches. The settlement itself became a shell, important enough to defend, not important enough to die for. Vaelor drilled them relentlessly, not like a king giving orders, like a commander who'd survived enough battles to know the difference between theory and reality. You're going to be terrified, he told a group of younger fighters during training. The moment real combat starts, every instinct will scream at you to freeze or run. That's normal, that's human. He paused, letting them absorb that. The difference between survivors and corpses is what you do with that fear. You weaponize it, let it sharpen your focus, make you faster, meaner, more willing to do whatever it takes. One fighter raised his hand nervously. How do you stop being afraid? You don't, Vaelor said flatly. Fear keeps you alive. You just stop letting it control you. That honesty, that raw acknowledgement of human weakness, did something the noble speeches never could. It made them trust him. Because he wasn't pretending they were heroes. He was treating them like survivors who hadn't died yet. And survival was something they understood. Marcus worked parallel operations, identifying the most capable fighters and forming specialized units. Fast response. Sabotage. Reconnaissance. All the elements of asymmetric warfare that conventional military training ignored. Within a week, Ironhearth stopped looking like a doomed resistance movement. It started looking like a threat. The Council's response came on day 9. Scouts reported massive troop movement heading toward their position. Not the couple hundred they'd expected. 800 professional soldiers, full siege equipment, supply trains, command structure indicating this wasn't just suppression. This was annihilation. The War Council convened an emergency session. Davith looked physically sick. 800. We can't. There's no way we can hold against 800. No, Vaelor agreed. You can't hold, so we don't hold. What? They're bringing overwhelming force because they think they're fighting a fortified position. They've prepared for siege warfare, extended assault, grinding you down through superior numbers and equipment. Vaelor leaned over the maps, eyes cold and calculating. Which means they've committed to a strategy that assumes you'll be where they expect you to be. Understanding started to dawn. You want to evacuate, one advisor said. I want to relocate, Vaelor corrected. There's a difference. Evacuation is retreat. Relocation is repositioning. He marked locations on the map. Ironhearth is a symbol, important for morale, terrible for tactical advantage. We move the actual fighting force here, a valley 15 miles northeast, where terrain completely neutralizes their numbers advantage. Then we leave just enough presence in Ironhearth to make them commit. They'll destroy the settlement, Davith said quietly. They'll destroy empty buildings, Vaelor replied. And while they're busy with that victory, we'll be destroying their supply lines, ambushing their patrols, and turning their overwhelming force into a liability. The room was silent. What he was suggesting wasn't just unconventional. It was admitting that the settlement they'd built, the symbol they'd rallied around, was expendable. That's the brutal calculus of survival. Sometimes you have to burn what you love to kill what you hate. How long do we have? Davith asked. 2 days, Vaelor said. Maybe 3. After that, they're close enough that moving becomes impossible. 2 days to relocate 300 fighters plus supplies. I've done more with less time. David looked around the room at his advisors, reading faces, weighing options that all tasted like ash. Finally, he nodded. Make it happen, boss. The evacuation was chaos wrapped in discipline. Fighters moved supplies through mountain passes under cover of darkness. Everything essential got relocated. Everything else got staged to look lived in enough to fool initial reconnaissance. Vaelor coordinated from the field, moving between groups with Marcus, ensuring nothing critical got left behind. On the second night, Kira approached him during a brief rest period. I need to know something, she said. He looked up from the maps he was reviewing. What? Are we going to win? The question hung between them, raw, honest, demanding truth instead of platitudes. Vaelor could have lied, could have given her the inspirational speech commanders use to keep people fighting when the odds are impossible. Instead, he said, depends on your definition of winning. Surviving, hurting them, making this matter. Then yes, Vaelor said, we're going to win. How can you be sure? He looked at her directly. Because I've lost everything except the skills that made me dangerous in the first place, and the council just reminded me what happens when you give a predator nothing left to protect. What happens? It stops pretending to be civilized. Kira studied him in the darkness. They're terrified of you, aren't they? The council. That's why they sent 800 soldiers. Fear is expensive, Vaelor said. The more they spend trying to kill me, the weaker they become everywhere else. Eventually, that cost becomes unsustainable. And then? Then the Empire fractures, and we're positioned to claim the pieces. It was the first time he'd said it out loud. Not just survival, not just revenge. Reconstruction, taking what the Council destroyed and rebuilding it into something that couldn't be toppled by frightened bureaucrats. Kira absorbed that. What you're describing is revolution. I'm describing evolution, Vaelor corrected. The Empire survives. It just needs better leadership. You. Someone, he said. Maybe me. Maybe someone who learns from my mistakes. But definitely not the people currently sitting in Blackthorn pretending they can rule through committee and compromise. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll fight for that. Vaelor nodded once. Good. Because what's coming next requires people willing to fight for something bigger than themselves. The relocation completed 30 hours before the Imperial Army arrived. Ironhearth stood empty, buildings intact, supplies staged to look recently abandoned. Just enough evidence of hasty evacuation to sell the story. And hidden in the valley 15 miles away, 300 fighters waited in terrain specifically chosen to turn numbers into disadvantage. Vaelor stood on a ridge overlooking the valley approach, Marcus beside him. Think they'll take the bait? The captain asked. They'll take it, Vaelor said, because they're thinking like conquerors, not tacticians. They see empty settlement, they'll assume victory, then they'll try to track us. And tracking means splitting forces through terrain we control. And when they figure it out, too late. Below, the first elements of the Imperial Army appeared on the horizon. 800 soldiers in disciplined formation, siege equipment, command structure visible from their movement patterns. Professional, overwhelming, absolutely confident in their superiority. They marched straight toward Ironhearth, and into the trap Vaelor had spent 2 weeks preparing. The ambush happened in stages. First, the Imperial scouts found Ironhearth abandoned, exactly as expected. Then they found signs of recent evacuation, trails heading northeast, evidence of hasty departure. They reported back to command. Vaelor watched from concealed position as the Imperial force divided. Half remained to secure Ironhearth, half pursued the evacuation trail. That's when the attacks began. Not direct assault, not open combat. Harassment, sabotage, constant, unrelenting pressure designed to fragment their cohesion. Supply wagons disappeared, patrols vanished. Scouts reported enemy contact that evaporated before reinforcements arrived. The pursuing force slowed, grew cautious, started making defensive decisions. And defensive decisions in hostile terrain against an enemy you can't pin down are how professional armies die slowly. 3 days of this. 3 days of watching Imperial discipline erode under constant psychological pressure. Then Vaelor gave the order for real combat. The valley where the Imperial force had committed their pursuit was a kill box, narrow, surrounded by elevation, approaches that forced them into compressed formation where superior numbers meant nothing. Ironhearth's fighters attacked from every direction simultaneously, not like army, like swarm, fast, brutal. Exploiting every weakness Vaelor had identified during planning, the battle was chaos. Vaelor fought in the center of it, blade moving with terrifying precision, every movement economic, every strike lethal, no wasted motion, no hesitation. This was what he'd been built for, not ruling, not politics, combat, pure, unfiltered, absolutely remorseless combat. Marcus fought beside him, protecting flanks, coordinating mobile units through hand signals. Around them, Ironhearth's fighters discovered something crucial. They could win. Not through superior numbers, not through better equipment, through superior tactics led by someone who understood warfare at fundamental level. The Imperial force tried to rally, tried to form defensive positions, but Vaelor had anticipated every move, every standard response, every tactical decision they'd been trained to make, because he'd written the training. Within 2 hours, the pursuing force broke, not defeated, not destroyed, but scattered, demoralized. Retreating back toward Ironhearth with casualties they couldn't afford and psychological damage that would ripple through the entire army. Vaelor let them go. Pursuit would have been costly, and he didn't need total victory. He needed demonstration. Proof that the Council's overwhelming force could be beaten by smaller numbers with better leadership. That message would spread faster than any proclamation. That night, Ironhearth's fighters celebrated. Not victory, not conquest. Survival against impossible odds. Vaelor didn't join the celebration. He stood apart, watching the fires, mind already 3 moves ahead. Davith approached quietly. "We won," the Lord said. "We survived the opening move," Vaelor corrected. "The real war hasn't started yet." "What comes next?" Vaelor turned to face him. "The Council just lost 800 soldiers and gained nothing. That's going to create problems. Political instability, questions about military competence, demands for accountability. You're going to exploit that. I'm going to accelerate it." Vaelor's expression was cold. "We start hitting supply lines, communication networks, anything that makes governing difficult. Force them to choose between maintaining control or chasing us." "That's terrorism. That's insurgency," Vaelor said. "And it's the only way to break an empire when you don't have one of your own." Davith was quiet for a moment. "You're going to burn it all down, aren't you? The entire structure." "I'm going to give people a choice," Vaelor replied. "Follow a council that can't protect them, or follow someone who just proved he can win against their best forces. And if they don't choose you, then they burn with the council." The ruthlessness of it was breathtaking. No mercy, no compromise. Just absolute commitment to a vision that required complete destruction before reconstruction could begin. Davith should have been horrified. Instead, he just looked tired. "I used to think you were a tyrant," he said quietly. "Now I realize you were just honest about what power requires." "Power requires consequences," Vaelor said. "The Council forgot that. They thought removing me eliminated the threat. They didn't understand that I was never the threat. I was the consequence of everyone else's cowardice." Behind them, the celebration continued. Fighters who'd survived their first real battle, who'd proven they could stand against Empire and not break. But Vaelor saw what they didn't yet understand. This wasn't the beginning of revolution. This was the point where revolution became inevitable, where survival stopped being enough and transformation became necessary, where a deposed king stopped running and started rebuilding. Not the empire he'd lost. Something more dangerous. An empire built by people who'd already lost everything and discovered they were still standing. Davith left him alone eventually. Vaelor stood watching the fires until Marcus approached. "The scouts found something," his captain said quietly. "What?" "Imperial command didn't retreat to Blackthorn. They're regrouping 20 miles south, building fortifications. Looks like they're preparing for extended campaign instead of withdrawal." Vaelor absorbed that. They're not giving up. No, someone's forcing them to stay, someone who doesn't care about casualties or political cost. "Mordrake," Vaelor said quietly. Marcus nodded. Has to be. Only person crazy enough to coordinate with the council while maintaining independent operation. Where is he? Unknown. But if he's coordinating Imperial forces, he's got leverage. Something that makes the council take orders from a warlord they should have executed years ago. Vaelor felt pieces clicking together. Mordrake had leverage. The council was compromised. And somewhere in that connection was the person who'd orchestrated his exile. The real enemy. Not bureaucrats playing at power. Not frightened nobles protecting their wealth. Someone calculating enough to weaponize both the council and a warlord against a common threat. Someone who understood that removing Vaelor required more than political maneuvering. It required making him irrelevant. We need intel, Vaelor said. Someone close to Imperial command. Someone who knows what Mordrake's offering in exchange for cooperation. That's deep infiltration, Marcus said. Could take weeks. We don't have weeks. Then what? Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would either end the war or escalate it beyond control. Send message to Commander Lyanna Frost, he said. Marcus stared. The woman who tried to kill you at Ashmark? The woman who hesitated before trying to kill me, Vaelor corrected. She's still loyal to something. Question is whether it's the council or something deeper. And if she refuses? Then we kill her, Vaelor said simply. But if she accepts, we get access to Imperial command structure from inside. That's insane. That's necessary. Vaelor looked at his captain. War isn't won by playing safe, it's won by making moves your enemy can't anticipate. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the gamble, accepting the risk. I'll send word, he said. Make it clear, Vaelor added. She comes alone, neutral ground. If this is trap, everyone dies. And if it's not? Vaelor smiled, cold and sharp. Then we just recruited the council's best tactical commander, he said. And the real war finally begins. The meeting place was a ruin, old watchtower from wars fought before Vaelor was born, halfway collapsed into the mountainside, surrounded by terrain that made ambush obvious and escape routes plentiful. Neutral ground in the truest sense. Nobody owned it, nobody wanted it, and anybody stupid enough to stage a trap here deserved whatever happened next. Vaelor arrived 2 hours early, not alone despite the terms. Marcus positioned 50 yards out with a crossbow and sightlines covering every approach. 3 more fighters scattered through the ruins with orders to kill anything that moved wrong. Trust was a luxury. Verification was survival. He stood in what remained of the tower's main chamber, studying the carved stone walls still bearing marks from siege fire decades old. Someone had fought and died here for reasons nobody remembered anymore. That's what happened to most causes. They burned bright, consumed their believers, and left nothing but scorched ruins for the next generation to puzzle over. History didn't remember the righteous. It remembered the survivors. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the mountains in shades of blood and shadow. Vaelor's hand rested on the blade at his hip, not gripping, not tense, just present, ready. Then he heard footsteps, measured, deliberate, the careful approach of someone who'd walked into enough ambushes to recognize the signs. Commander Lyanna Frost emerged from the tree line alone. She'd come as requested. No armor, no guards, just traveling leathers and the kind of weapons you carried for personal protection, not military assault. That meant something. Either she was genuinely considering his offer, or she was confident enough in her backup plan that appearing vulnerable was part of the strategy. Vaelor watched her approach through the ruins, evaluating body language, searching for tells. She stopped 20 feet away. Speaking distance. Close enough to read expressions, far enough that sudden violence gave both parties reaction time. Professional distance. They studied each other in the fading light. Former king and former protege. Commander and the soldier he'd elevated from obscurity. 2 people whose history was written in shared battlefields and mutual respect that had somehow curdled into this, standing on opposite sides of a conflict neither fully understood. Lyanna spoke first. Her voice was controlled, carrying none of the formal military tone she'd used at Ashmark. This was personal now, stripped of performance, just 2 people who'd bled together trying to figure out if they were about to kill each other. How did it come to this? She looked exhausted, not physically, spiritually. The kind of tired that comes from making impossible choices until you forget why any of it mattered. You know exactly how, Vaelor thought. You made the same choices everyone makes when survival and loyalty collide. Neither spoke for a long moment. The silence stretched between them like a blade being slowly drawn from its sheath. Finally, Vaelor broke it. "You came," he said simply. "You asked," Lyanna replied. "That doesn't mean you had to listen." She shifted her weight slightly. Subtle. Unconscious. The movement of someone who'd spent their entire adult life in combat situations learning to read threat levels through muscle memory. "I'm listening now," she said. "Doesn't mean I'm agreeing to anything. Fair enough." Vaelor moved away from the wall, not toward her, just establishing that he wasn't hiding. "Why did you really come? Curiosity? Guilt? Or something else?" Her jaw tightened. "You said you had an offer. I said I wanted to talk. Those aren't the same thing. Then talk." Vaelor studied her for another moment, reading micro-expressions, weighing sincerity against performance. Then he made his gamble. "Tell me about Mordrake," he said. The name landed like a blade between them. Lyanna's entire body went still. Not frozen. Controlled. The kind of stillness that comes from training your reactions so they don't betray you. But her eyes told him everything. "What about him?" she asked carefully. "You know what about him?" Vaelor's voice stayed level, calm. But underneath ran a current of absolute certainty. He coordinated the Ashmark attack with Imperial forces. That doesn't happen without someone inside the council giving him access. Someone with authority. Someone who convinced military command to work with a warlord they should have executed years ago. Lyanna said nothing. "So I'm asking you directly," Vaelor continued. "Who's controlling Mordrake? Who has enough leverage over the council to make them betray every principle they claim to stand for?" The silence that followed was answer enough. She knew, and knowing without telling made her complicit. Vaelor took a step forward, not threatening, just closing distance enough that she couldn't hide behind professional neutrality anymore. "I promoted you," he said quietly. "Gave you command when senior officers wanted you buried in logistics. Trusted you with operations that could have destroyed the Empire if you'd failed. And you repaid that by marching 20 soldiers to my doorstep demanding surrender." Lyanna's hands clenched at her sides. "You built an empire on terror." "I built an empire on consequences," Vaelor corrected. "There's a difference. Terror is random. Consequences are earned. Every execution I ordered, every house I dismantled, every rebellion I crushed, those were consequences of choices people made. I gave them every opportunity to choose differently. And when they didn't choose what you wanted, you killed them. When they chose civil war over stability, yes. When they chose personal ambition over collective survival, yes. When they decided their pride was worth more than thousands of lives, absolutely yes." Vaelor's voice hardened. "I'm not asking you to approve of my methods. I'm asking you to acknowledge that they worked. The Empire was stable, functional, growing, and the moment you people removed me, what happened?" Lyanna looked away. "What happened?" Vaelor pressed. "Factional fighting," she said quietly. "Provincial lords positioning for advantage. Supply line failures. 3 assassination attempts on council members in the first month. And how many of those problems existed when I was ruling?" Her silence was damning. Vaelor let it sit for a moment, then, softer, almost gentle. "You know I'm right," he said. "You wouldn't have come here if you thought the council was actually capable of holding this together. So tell me who's really in charge. Help me end this before the entire empire tears itself apart." Lyanna met his eyes finally. And there, right there in that moment, he saw the fracture. The split between what she'd been trained to believe and what she'd witnessed firsthand. Between the version of events the council fed her and the reality playing out across the territories. She wanted to tell him. He could see it in every line of her body. The desire to unburden herself of whatever knowledge was eating her from inside. But something held her back, fear, loyalty, or something worse. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the weight of someone about to commit irreversible action. "Lady Seraphine Vale," she said. The name hit Vaelor like a physical blow. Everything stopped. The world. His breathing. Time itself seemed to grind to halt while his brain processed information that refused to make sense. Seraphine. The daughter of the Vale bloodline. The woman sent to his court as political offering. The only person in his entire reign who'd looked at him without fear or worship, just unflinching assessment. The woman he'd begun to... No. He shut that thought down before it could finish forming. Lyanna continued, reading his shock, pressing the advantage. She's been organizing this since before she arrived at court, coordinating with Mordrake, manipulating the council. Everything that happened, your exile, the attacks, the military operations, she orchestrated all of it. Why? The word came out harder than Vaelor intended. Revenge. Lyanna's expression was unreadable. You destroyed her family, scattered the Vale bloodline, left her with nothing but a name and a title that meant nothing. She spent years building connections, gathering resources, waiting for the right moment. And the council just let her? The council doesn't know she's controlling them. They think they're making independent decisions. She's been feeding them information, manipulating circumstances, making them believe that removing you was their idea. Lyanna paused. She's better at this than you were. More patient, more subtle. You ruled through force. She rules through perception. Vaelor felt something cold settling into his chest. Not anger, not betrayal. Recognition. He'd underestimated her, completely. Saw her resistance as personal strength instead of calculated performance. Mistook her directness for honesty when it was actually the most sophisticated manipulation he'd encountered. She played me, he said quietly. She played everyone. Lyanna took a step closer. That's why I came. Because whatever else you were predictable. Brutal, but consistent. We knew where we stood. But Seraphine, she's rebuilding the Empire into something else, something more dangerous. What does she want? Power. Control. And you dead in a way that destroys your legacy completely. Lyanna's voice dropped. The council thinks they're transitioning to stability. They don't realize she's dismantling every structure you built so she can replace it with her own. When she's done, the Empire won't just forget you existed. It'll actively celebrate your removal. That should have made him angry. Should have triggered the rage that had carried him through a decade of ruling. Instead, Vaelor felt something else entirely. Admiration. Seraphine had done what no enemy ever managed. She'd infiltrated his empire, turned his own systems against him, and orchestrated his downfall without ever appearing threatening. While he was building walls, she was digging tunnels underneath them. While he was crushing obvious enemies, she was becoming indispensable to the people closest to him. It was perfect, ruthless, patient, absolutely devastating. Everything he taught her to be without realizing he was teaching her. Where is she now? He asked. Blackthorn. Lyanna watched him carefully. Acting as interim regent, the council defers to her on most major decisions. Within 6 months, she'll formalize power, probably marry into one of the provincial houses, legitimize her position, and consolidate control. And Mordrake? Her attack dog. She gives him targets, he delivers results. The council thinks they're coordinating with military necessity. They don't know she's directing him. Vaelor absorbed all of it. Processing, calculating, then, "Help me stop her," he said. Lyanna laughed, bitter and exhausted. Stop her? You don't even understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me. She's not your enemy anymore. Lyanna's expression was almost pitying. She's become what you should have been from the beginning. A ruler who doesn't need fear because she's built genuine loyalty. People follow her because they believe in her vision, not because they're terrified of consequences. And you think that makes her better? I think it makes her unbeatable. The commander shook her head. You could conquer territories. You could crush rebellions, but you couldn't make people actually want your rule. She can. And that's why you've already lost. The words should have stung, should have felt like defeat. Instead, they crystallized something Vaelor had been circling around since Ashmark burned. He'd been fighting the wrong war, trying to reclaim what was taken, restore what was lost, return to power through the same methods that got him exiled. But Seraphine hadn't just taken his throne. She'd made it irrelevant, built something new while he was still clinging to the old. That's why every move he made felt like fighting shadow, because she wasn't competing with his model of power. She was replacing it entirely. You're right, Vaelor said quietly. Lyanna blinked, surprised. What? I can't beat her by being what I was. That game's over. She won. Then why did you bring me here? Because I needed to know who I was really fighting. Vaelor's expression hardened. Now I do. And what are you going to do with that information? Vaelor looked at her directly. Learn, adapt. Become something she can't predict. You can't change your nature. Watch me. The certainty in his voice made Lyanna take an involuntary step back, because she recognized that tone. Had heard it before on battlefields when Vaelor made decisions that shifted entire campaigns. When he committed to courses of action that seemed insane until they worked. This wasn't desperation. This was evolution. I need you to do something for me, Vaelor said. Lyanna's hand moved toward her weapon. What? Go back to the council. Tell them you found me. Tell them I'm broken, scattered, running with a handful of loyal followers and no real plan. Make them think I'm exactly what they want me to be, a deposed king clinging to past glory. That's suicide. If they think you're vulnerable, they'll send everything. Good. Let them. Vaelor smiled, cold and sharp. Let them commit resources to hunting a ghost. While they're busy with that, I'll be building something they can't see coming. You're talking about insurgency, guerrilla warfare. I'm talking about becoming the kind of threat they can't eliminate by killing me. Vaelor's voice dropped. Seraphine built a movement. I'm going to build a revolution. Against your own empire? Against the people who stole it. There's a difference. Lyanna studied him, trying to figure out if this was genuine strategy or delusion. Then she made her choice. I can give you 3 weeks, she said quietly. Maybe a month? After that, they'll start asking questions I can't deflect. That's enough. What are you planning? The less you know, the better, Vaelor paused. But Lyanna, when this goes loud, you need to choose which side you're on, because there won't be neutral ground anymore. She nodded slowly. I know. They stood there in the ruins as darkness finished claiming the mountains. 2 people who'd fought together, betrayed each other, and now were gambling everything on strategies neither fully trusted. Finally, Lyanna turned to leave. She made it 3 steps before Vaelor called after her. Why did you really come? She stopped. Didn't turn around. Because I remember what you were before the crown corrupted you, she said quietly, and I wanted to see if any of that man still existed. And? She looked back over her shoulder. I don't know yet, she said, but I hope he does, because the Empire needs that version of Vaelor Draven, not the tyrant, the leader. Then she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Vaelor alone in the ruins with information that changed everything. Marcus emerged from concealment once she was gone. You trust her? The captain asked. No, Vaelor said, but I trust that she's as trapped as we are, and trapped people make predictable choices. What's the play? We disappear. Completely. Let the council think they've scattered us. Meanwhile, we start building something they can't track. Building what? Vaelor looked at him directly. The Empire's replacement, he said. The next 3 weeks were invisible. No battles, no confrontations, no dramatic gestures that would register on the Council's awareness. Just systematic, relentless preparation. Vaelor split Ironheart's forces into cells, small groups, mobile, independent, each with specific objectives and zero knowledge of the larger operation. Classic insurgency structure. If one cell got compromised, it couldn't betray what it didn't know. He sent Marcus to make contact with provincial lords who'd been quietly resistant to the Council's rule. Not recruiting them, just planting seeds, reminding them that alternatives existed if they got tired of answering to Blackthorn. Meanwhile, Vaelor focused on something more dangerous. Information warfare. The Council ruled through perception, made people believe their authority was legitimate, necessary, inevitable. So Vaelor started poisoning that perception, carefully, subtly, through networks that couldn't be traced back to him, rumors about council corruption, stories about Seraphine's true intentions, questions about why the Empire had grown more unstable since Vaelor's removal. Nothing provable, nothing obvious, just doubt. Seeded carefully into populations already stressed by the Council's heavy-handed governance. That's how you fight someone who rules through belief. You don't attack their power directly. You attack the foundation that power rests on. Make people question, wonder, start looking for cracks in the narrative they've been fed. And once doubt takes root, it spreads like disease. Davith coordinated the political operations from Ironhearth's new hidden location, reaching out to contacts, building coalition, creating framework for what came next. On the 20th day, Kira returned from reconnaissance with news. The council's mobilizing, she reported, major troop movements toward the northern territories. They're hunting for you. Let them hunt, Vaelor said. How many? 1,500 soldiers, full siege equipment. Command structure suggests they're expecting prolonged campaign. Vaelor absorbed that. 1,500 was significant. Not quite the full Imperial military, but close. That meant Seraphine was committed. Good. The more resources she spent chasing him, the weaker her actual position became. What about Blackthorn? He asked. Any changes in the capital? Kira hesitated. There's talk. People questioning why so many soldiers are being deployed north when the southern provinces are having supply issues. Vaelor felt something click. That's the opening. Not military. Political. The council was overextending, focusing on eliminating him while neglecting actual governance. And populations noticed when roads didn't get maintained, supplies didn't arrive, infrastructure started degrading. That dissatisfaction was resource. Weaponizable resource. He turned to Davith. I need you to accelerate provincial outreach. Start making concrete offers. Protection, stability, alternative governance structures. The Lord looked uncertain. We don't have the resources to back those promises. Not yet, Vaelor agreed. But we will. The Council's about to make their biggest mistake, which is proving they care more about killing me than protecting their people. It was brutal calculus. Using his own persecution as evidence of the Council's priorities. Turning their military campaign into political liability. But that's what insurgency required, finding leverage in places conventional warfare ignored. Over the next week, the transformation accelerated. Provincial lords started quietly severing ties with Blackthorn. Not openly, not officially, just slow withdrawal of support, delayed tax payments, ignored directives, subtle resistance that was harder to punish than outright rebellion. The council noticed. How could they not? Their authority was being undermined from within while they committed resources to external threat. Classic strategic trap. Chase the obvious enemy and ignore the structural collapse happening behind you. Vaelor watched it unfold from hidden positions, seeing patterns the council couldn't recognize because they were too close to them. This was working, slowly, carefully, but working. Then everything shattered. The message arrived on day 24. Hand-delivered by a rider who'd nearly killed his horse getting to Ironhearth's location. Marcus brought it to Vaelor immediately, expression grim. From Lyanna, the captain said. Vaelor broke the seal, reading quickly, then read it again. Because the first time couldn't possibly be right, but the words didn't change. They're not hunting you. They're hunting provincial lords. Seraphine convinced the council that your support comes from territorial resistance. She's authorized military action against any province suspected of harboring insurgents. Executions start tomorrow at dawn. The bottom dropped out of Vaelor's world. She'd flipped the script entirely, made him the excuse for purging potential opposition, used his insurgency as justification for consolidating control through terror. Everything he'd built, the careful coalition, the provincial resistance, the alternative governance structures, all of it was about to be dismantled through mass execution. How many? Marcus asked quietly. Vaelor forced himself to look at the second page. Names, dozens of them. Provincial governors, local administrators. Anyone who'd shown even subtle resistance to Blackthorn's authority. Scheduled for public execution as traitors and insurgent collaborators. 200 people, Vaelor said. Maybe more. Marcus went pale. That's genocide. Vaelor finished. Selective, targeted genocide designed to eliminate anyone capable of organizing resistance. We have to warn them. No. Vaelor's voice was flat, cold. By the time warnings arrive, it'll be too late. She's already positioned soldiers. This isn't negotiation. It's fait accompli. Then what do we do? Vaelor stared at the list of names. People who'd trusted him, believed in the alternative he'd promised, committed themselves to resistance because he'd made it seem possible. And now they were going to die for that belief. Because Seraphine had anticipated his strategy and weaponized it against him. This was what ruling through manipulation looked like. You didn't crush enemies directly. You made them destroy themselves, made their own actions become the justification for their elimination. Vaelor had taught the Empire to fear consequences. Seraphine had taught it to manufacture them. "We surrender," Vaelor said quietly. Marcus stared. "What?" "We surrender. Publicly. Completely. I return to Blackthorn, face trial, accept whatever judgment they impose. That's suicide. That's the only move that saves those people." Vaelor's voice stayed level despite the turmoil underneath. "She's using me as excuse. Remove the excuse, remove the justification. She'll kill you, probably, but she'll have to do it officially, through trial. That buys time, creates political complications. And maybe, it saves 200 people who don't deserve to die for my war." Marcus shook his head. "You can't." "I can." Vaelor met his eyes. "This is my responsibility. I started this. I brought them into it. Now I end it before more people burn." The captain looked like he wanted to argue, but they both knew there was no argument to make. The brutal mathematics of survival had shifted. Continuing the insurgency meant watching provincial lords die. Surrendering meant Vaelor died, but others potentially lived. Not a choice. An equation. And Vaelor had always been good at math. "Send word to Blackthorn," he said. "King Vaelor Draven surrenders unconditionally. He'll return to the capital to face justice. In exchange, the provincial executions stop immediately. Lyanna won't. Lyanna will relay the message. What Seraphine does with it is her choice." Vaelor's expression hardened, but at least it forces her to make that choice publicly, and public choices create accountability. It was thin logic, desperate logic, but it was all he had. Marcus left to send the message. Vaelor stood alone, staring at the list of names that represented everything his revolution had become. Not liberation, not justice, just more people dying because he'd refused to stay dead. That's what power costs when you lose it. Not your own life. The lives of everyone foolish enough to believe you could get it back. Reshape. The response came within hours, faster than should have been possible, which meant Seraphine had been waiting for this move. Anticipated it, prepared for it, probably planned around it weeks ago. The message was simple. Surrender accepted. King Vaelor Draven will return to Blackthorn under military escort. Provincial execution suspended pending his arrival. Trial scheduled for 3 days following his return to the capital. Professional. Formal. Exactly what you'd expect from legitimate authority accepting a criminal's surrender. But underneath the official language, Vaelor could read the subtext. She'd won. Completely. Not just militarily, not just politically, psychologically. She'd forced him to choose between his own survival and the lives of people who'd supported him. Made him surrender not because she'd beaten him in combat, but because she'd made continuing to fight unbearable. That was power, real power. The kind that didn't need armies because it controlled the terrain inside your own head. Vaelor had conquered kingdoms. Seraphine had conquered him. The escort arrived the next morning. 50 soldiers. Professional. Heavily armed. Led by an officer Vaelor didn't recognize. Younger generation, probably promoted after his exile. They treated him with clinical efficiency. No respect, no fear, just bureaucratic process. Restrained but not brutalized. Guarded but not tortured. He was cargo now. Not king, not even enemy. Just problem being transported to final resolution. Marcus tried to follow. The officer blocked him. Surrender terms specified King Vaelor only. "I'm his captain. You're a civilian with no official standing." The officer's tone was flat. "You can petition the council for visitation rights after the trial." Marcus looked at Vaelor, expression desperate, asking permission, seeking orders, wanting direction. But Vaelor had nothing left to give. "Stand down," he said quietly. "Let them take me. This is wrong. This is necessary." Vaelor met his eyes one final time. "Tell Davith to dissolve the coalition. Send everyone home. End this before more people die for a cause that's already lost." Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck, but he stepped back. Let the soldiers take Vaelor. Watched his king, his commander, the man he'd followed through exile and insurgency, get escorted away like common criminal, and understood that some battles can't be won through loyalty. Some battles are lost the moment you accept the enemy's framing of what victory means. The journey to Blackthorn took 4 days. They traveled main roads this time. No hiding, no discretion. The council wanted people to see, wanted populations to witness the deposed king being brought back in chains. Proof that resistance was futile, that challenging authority only ended one way. This was theater, carefully staged, deliberately public, designed to break not just Vaelor, but the idea that he'd ever represented viable alternative. He watched it happen in real time, saw the crowds that gathered when they passed through settlements, read the expressions, the mix of fear, curiosity, satisfaction. Some people jeered, others just watched silently, but nobody intervened. Nobody raised voices in protest. Nobody suggested that maybe, just maybe, the council's version of events wasn't entirely accurate. That's what total victory looks like. Not defeating your enemy. Making everyone believe your enemy deserved defeat. On the third night, camped under guard, Vaelor lay awake staring at stars through the gaps in his prison tent, wondering what Seraphine was thinking right now. Whether she felt triumphant, satisfied, or something more complicated. She'd won, completely, devastatingly, outplayed him at every level. But winning this way, through manipulation, through forcing his surrender rather than earning it through direct conflict that came with its own costs. She'd have to live knowing she'd never actually beaten him, just made staying alive unbearable. That hollow feeling probably kept her awake too. Or maybe not. Maybe she'd evolved past caring about those distinctions, past needing validation from the people she destroyed. That would make her more dangerous than Vaelor had ever been, because his brutality had limits. Hers might not. On the fourth day, they reached Blackthorn. The obsidian towers rose against gray sky, like tombstones marking the grave of everything Vaelor had built. The city looked the same, but felt different, smaller somehow, less vital. Or maybe that was just how exile changed perception, made places that once felt like home seem foreign. They brought him through the main gates, through streets he'd walked 1,000 times as king, past buildings that housed memories now inaccessible. People lined the streets watching, more theater, more proof of authority's triumph. Finally, they reached Blackthorn's citadel itself, the fortress he'd ruled from for a decade, where he'd made decisions that shaped the continent, where he'd believed himself untouchable. Now it was his prison. They took him inside through the ceremonial entrance, deliberate choice, forcing him to walk the same path he'd walked during coronation, down corridors lined with black marble and crimson banners, past throne room where he'd received tribute and dispensed justice. Everything exactly as he'd left it, except he wasn't king anymore. He was defendant, and the throne he'd sat on now held someone else. They brought him to a holding chamber deep in the citadel, stone walls, single door, no windows. The officer removed his restraints. "Trial begins tomorrow at dawn," he said. "Council will hear charges. You'll have opportunity to respond. And then? Judgment." The officer's expression was professionally neutral. Probably execution, maybe exile if you're fortunate. Vaelor almost laughed. Exile. Back where he started. Except this time there'd be no ash mark, no iron hearth, no possibility of rebuilding because Seraphine would make sure any refuge he found burned before he could establish foothold. This really was the end. The officer left. Guards locked the door from outside. And Vaelor stood alone in the cell, surrounded by walls that had once protected him, now designed to contain him. He should have felt defeated, should have felt the weight of total loss crushing whatever remained of his pride. Instead, he felt something else. Clarity. Cold, absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. Because Seraphine had made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed surrender meant acceptance. That bringing him back to Blackthorn, putting him on trial, executing him publicly would end the threat he represented. But she'd forgotten the most important lesson about predators. You never trap them where they're most dangerous. And Vaelor was back inside the citadel he'd designed, the fortress he knew better than anyone alive. The place where every secret passage, every structural weakness, every exploitable vulnerability had been built according to his specifications. She'd won every battle, leading to this moment. But she'd delivered him straight into terrain where conventional victory stopped mattering, where knowledge became weapon, where the game changed completely. Vaelor sat down on the cold stone floor, back against the wall, and began planning. Not escape, not revenge, something more fundamental. Evolution. She'd beaten the king. Time to show her what came after kingship ended. Time to become something she couldn't predict, couldn't control, couldn't survive. The trial would begin at dawn, but the real judgment, the one that mattered, would happen long before the council passed sentence. And Seraphine Vael was about to discover that destroying a man's empire didn't destroy the man. It just removed the only restraint keeping him civilized. Dawn came cold and brutal. Vaelor had been awake for hours, not sleeping, not resting, just sitting in absolute stillness while his mind mapped every corridor, every guard rotation, every structural vulnerability of Blackthorn's citadel that he'd spent 10 years memorizing. People think strength is about muscle, about violence, about the capacity to inflict damage. They're wrong. Real strength is about understanding that when you've lost everything, you stop being constrained by the fear of losing more. That's when predators become most dangerous, not when they're protecting territory, when they have nothing left to protect. The guards came for him as sunlight started bleeding through the high windows of the citadel. 6 of them, armed, professional, treating him like explosive cargo that might detonate if mishandled. They restrained his wrists, not brutal, just efficient. Led him through corridors he'd walked 1,000 times as king, past chambers where he'd made decisions that shaped empires, through halls lined with portraits of rulers who'd come before him, most of them forgotten, their names lost to time, their empires crumbled into dust. That's the truth about power that nobody wants to acknowledge. It's temporary. Always. The only question is whether you leave something worth remembering or just another cautionary tale about ambition. They brought him to the Grand Council chamber. Massive space, vaulted ceilings, black marble floors polished to mirror shine, rows of seats arranged in concentric semicircles facing the central judgment floor, where defendants stood to face charges. The room was packed, council members in their formal robes, military commanders in dress uniforms, provincial representatives who'd traveled to witness this moment, common citizens permitted entry to see justice performed publicly. Theater. All of it theater designed to demonstrate that authority functioned through law, not arbitrary violence. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. Vaelor stepped onto the judgment floor, guards flanking him, and finally allowed himself to look at the elevated platform where the council sat. 12 seats, 12 bureaucrats who'd spent careers avoiding accountability while pretending to serve the realm. But his eyes went past them to the throne positioned slightly above and behind, the seat traditionally reserved for the monarch during council proceedings. Lady Seraphine Vael sat there, not in royal robes, not with crown or formal regalia, just simple but elegant dress in deep emerald that made her look simultaneously unthreatening and absolutely in control. She was staring directly at him. Their eyes met across the chamber, and in that moment, Vaelor saw everything clearly. The calculation behind every smile she'd given him during her time at court, the careful performance of resistance that had made him think she was genuine, the patient manipulation that had convinced him she was different from other courtiers when actually she was just better at the game. She'd studied him, learned him, identified every weakness, and exploited them with surgical precision. And now she sat on the throne he'd vacated, watching him stand in chains, probably feeling whatever complicated emotion comes from destroying someone you'd spent months pretending to respect. The head counselor, Lord Casimir, still alive somehow despite orchestrating the original coup, stood and addressed the chamber. King Vaelor Draven stands accused of crimes against the realm, tyranny, excessive violence, abuse of authority, unauthorized executions. His voice carried through the space with practiced formality. This council will hear evidence, permit defense, and render judgment according to law. Law. The word tasted like ashes in Vaelor's mouth. These people had no concept of law, just convenience wrapped in legal language. But he said nothing, just stood there, waiting. Let them perform their circus. The prosecution began presenting evidence, documents, testimonies, a parade of witnesses describing atrocities committed under his rule. Some of it was true. He'd executed people, crushed rebellions, made brutal choices that saved thousands by sacrificing dozens. But some of it was fabricated, exaggerated, twisted to make necessary violence look like sadistic cruelty. That's how you destroy someone's legacy. You take the hard decisions they made and remove all context until only the bloodshed remains. Vaelor listened to it all with stone face, not reacting, not defending. Let them talk. Let them build their case. Let them think they were winning. Because every moment they spent on this performance was another moment he was inside Blackthorn's citadel, memorizing current guard positions, identifying changed security protocols, calculating exactly how long he had before opportunity disappeared. After 3 hours of testimony, Casimir finally addressed him directly. King Vaelor, you have right to respond to these charges. What say you in your defense? The chamber went silent, everyone waiting to hear what the deposed tyrant would say. Whether he'd beg, rage, attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Vaelor looked at Casimir, then at Seraphine, then at the assembled crowd, and spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. His voice was calm, level, carrying none of the emotion everyone expected. I say you're all cowards. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, outrage, council members lurching to their feet demanding he be silenced. But Casimir raised a hand, curious despite himself. Explain. You built your entire case on cherry-picked atrocities while ignoring everything that made them necessary. Vaelor's tone didn't rise, didn't sharpen, just stayed factual. Every execution you listed, I can name the rebellion it prevented. Every brutal crackdown, I can show you the civil war it avoided. I ruled through consequences because this empire doesn't survive on goodwill in committee meetings. You ruled through terror, someone shouted. I ruled through clarity, Vaelor corrected. Everyone knew exactly what happened if they chose violence over stability. And because of that clarity, the empire functioned. Roads stayed maintained, trade flourished, provinces stayed peaceful. You people removed that clarity. And what happened? The chaos began within weeks. The council, Lady Seraphine interrupted, speaking for the first time. Her voice cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. The council has provided stability through legitimate governance rather than intimidation. Vaelor laughed, cold and humorless. Stability? You've executed more people in 2 months than I did in my final year of ruling. You've just disguised it as law enforcement instead of calling it what it is. Terror under a different name. Seraphine's expression didn't change. We are not on trial here. No, Vaelor agreed, but you should be. The chamber erupted into chaos, council members shouting for order, guards moving forward to restrain him, citizens arguing among themselves. And through it all, Vaelor watched Seraphine, saw the flash of something in her eyes, anger, recognition, maybe respect. She'd expected him to beg or rage. Instead, he'd gone on offense, turned the trial into indictment of the council itself. It wouldn't save him, but it planted doubt, made people question, forced them to consider that maybe, just maybe, the official narrative wasn't complete. That's all he needed. Not victory, just uncertainty. Because uncertainty was resource, weaponizable resource. Casimir finally restored order, pounding his gavel until silence reluctantly returned. The defendant will refrain from outbursts. This is trial, not debate forum. Then stop pretending it's anything but execution with paperwork, Vaelor said. You've already decided I'm guilty. This entire proceeding is just performance to make murder look legitimate. The council requires The council requires my death to consolidate power. Vaelor's voice finally hardened. But understand something. Killing me doesn't end what I represent. It proves it. Every person watching this farce is learning that challenging authority ends in show trial and execution. You're teaching them exactly what I taught them. Fear works. You taught them nothing but cruelty, Seraphine said quietly. I taught them survival. Vaelor met her eyes. And you're teaching them the same lesson with prettier words. Silence fell between them, the entire chamber feeling the weight of that exchange, the recognition that despite everything, despite the coup, the exile, the surrender, the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. Two philosophies of power colliding, his through brutal honesty about violence, hers through sophisticated manipulation disguised as legitimacy. Neither was clean, neither was innocent, and everyone watching was starting to realize it. Casimir cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. The council will deliberate. Verdict will be announced. Now, Seraphine interrupted. She stood, moving to the front of the platform, This has gone on long enough. She looked directly at Vaelor, and for just a moment the performance dropped. The mask slipped. He saw something raw underneath, something that might have been regret, or might have been triumph, or might have been something more complicated. King Vaelor Draven, she said formally, you are found guilty of crimes against the realm. The sentence is death, to be carried out immediately by public execution. The chamber exploded into noise again, but Vaelor barely heard it, because he was reading Seraphine's expression, the micro-movements, the tension around her eyes that suggested this wasn't satisfaction. This was necessity. She didn't want to kill him. She had to, because letting him live meant constant threat, permanent instability. The knowledge that somewhere out there, the former king was waiting for opportunity to reclaim what he'd lost. That realization didn't make him feel better, but it clarified everything. This wasn't personal. This was strategic, and strategy could be countered if you were willing to pay the cost. Guards moved to escort him from the chamber, out to the execution courtyard, where the performance would conclude with his head on a block. Standard procedure, clean, final, demonstrating that authority couldn't be challenged without consequences. Except they'd made one critical mistake. They were executing him in the citadel he'd designed, the fortress he knew better than anyone alive. And that knowledge was about to become weapon. As they led him through the doorway, Vaelor spoke just loud enough for nearby guards to hear. 14 paces to the eastern corridor junction. Third flagstone from the wall. If you press hard on the northern edge, the floor mechanism releases. The guards froze, looking at him, then at the floor, confused. One of them, younger, less experienced, made the mistake of checking, stepped to the exact location Vaelor described, applied pressure. The flagstone shifted with mechanical click, and the floor section dropped away, revealing passage below that shouldn't have existed according to official Citadel blueprints. In the half-second of confusion that followed, Vaelor moved. Not like prisoner, like predator. His restrained hands came up, chain wrapping around the closest guard's throat, using the man's own momentum to throw him into two others. Bodies tangled, weapons clattered. Vaelor was already moving, diving into the revealed passage, hitting stone floor hard but rolling with the impact. Shouts erupted above. Crossbow bolts whined through the opening, shattering against stone where he'd been a heartbeat before. Then he was in the darkness of passages he'd built for exactly this purpose. Secret corridors. Hidden routes. Structural vulnerabilities turned into strategic assets during Citadel's original construction. Nobody knew they existed, except him. And now Seraphine was about to discover that bringing him back to Blackthorn was the worst mistake she'd made in an otherwise flawless campaign, because she'd returned the predator to his hunting ground. The passages beneath Blackthorn were labyrinth, narrow tunnels connecting chambers that hadn't seen light in years, maintenance shafts built into the Citadel's foundation, routes designed for exactly this scenario: siege, capture, escape. Vaelor moved through them with muscle memory, navigating by touch and spatial awareness when darkness became absolute. Behind him, he could hear chaos erupting through the Citadel. Alarms, guards mobilizing, the systematic lockdown that should have trapped him. Should have. Except lockdown protocols were designed to contain threats moving through official corridors, not someone using architecture itself as weapon. He reached a junction and stopped, listening. Footsteps above. Soldiers spreading out through levels trying to establish perimeter, their movements predictable, following training that assumed rational escape routes, but there was nothing rational about what Vaelor was planning. He climbed vertical shaft, using maintenance rungs corroded with age but still functional, up 3 levels. Then across lateral passage so narrow he had to move sideways, stones scraping against his shoulders. This was insanity. One wrong turn and he'd be trapped in passages with no exit. One missed calculation and guards would corner him in spaces too tight to fight in. But insanity was all he had left. And sometimes insanity was the only move that worked precisely because nobody anticipated it. He emerged in the Citadel's western wing, service area, kitchen access, the kind of location guards ignored because it had no strategic value. Exactly why it mattered. Vaelor moved through, finding servants' clothing hanging in storage room, changed quickly, ditched the prison garments. became an anonymous figure in space designed for invisibility. Then he started moving toward his real objective. Not escape, not freedom. Seraphine. Because this ended one of two ways. Either she killed him, or he removed her from the board entirely. Everything else was distraction. He navigated through servant corridors, moving with the confident efficiency of someone who belonged. Past guards twice. Both times they glanced at him and looked away, seeing servant, not threat. Perception was everything. Look like you belong and people's brains fill in the rest. 20 minutes after escaping the trial, Vaelor reached the residential wing where Seraphine maintained private chambers. This area was heavily guarded, 4 soldiers minimum on rotating watch. Advanced security protocols, everything designed to prevent exactly what he was attempting. Except he'd designed those protocols, knew where guards positioned themselves, understood sight lines, could predict movement patterns because he'd established them years ago. He waited in alcove, counting seconds, syncing his movement to the gap in coverage that existed for exactly 12 seconds every rotation. When the gap opened, he moved. Silent, fast, reaching the door to Seraphine's chambers and slipping inside before the window closed. The interior was dark, curtains drawn, minimal furniture. Everything functional rather than decorative. She wasn't here. Still at the council chamber probably, coordinating the search, managing the political fallout from his escape. Vaelor could have left, should have left. Used this opportunity to find actual escape route before security net tightened. Instead he stayed, sat down in chair facing the door, drew a blade he'd taken from the guard during his escape, and waited. Because some confrontations can't be avoided, some battles have to be fought regardless of odds, and he needed to look Seraphine in the eyes one more time before this ended. Needed to understand what she'd become. Whether the woman he'd started to respect still existed beneath the manipulation, or if power had consumed her the same way it had consumed everyone else who touched it. He sat there for an hour, completely still, barely breathing. The kind of patient stillness that comes from years of hunting. Then the door opened. Seraphine entered alone, clearly exhausted, already removing the formal council robes, revealing simple dress beneath. She made it 3 steps before she saw him. Her entire body went rigid, not panicked, just instantly alert. They stared at each other across the dimly lit chamber. Former king and the woman who'd destroyed him, predator, and the one person who'd outmaneuvered him completely. Finally, Seraphine spoke. Her voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that came from forcing down terror through sheer willpower. You should have run. Should have, Vaelor agreed. But I needed to know something first. What? Whether you actually believe the performance you're giving. She moved slowly toward the table, keeping distance between them, hands visible, but drifting toward where weapons might be hidden. What performance? The legitimate ruler act. The principled leader replacing the tyrant. All of it. Vaelor's grip on the blade stayed relaxed. Unthreatening. I need to know if you're genuinely trying to build something better or if you're just better at disguising the same brutality. Seraphine studied him, calculating, trying to determine if this was trap or genuine question. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not cruel, not mocking, just exhausted acknowledgement of absurdity. You really don't understand, do you? She moved to window, pulling back curtains slightly, looking out at the city below. I'm not disguising anything. I'm fixing what you broke. I didn't break the empire. You broke the people, Seraphine interrupted, turning to face him. You ruled so brutally for so long that they forgot how to function without fear. I'm not building something better. I'm rebuilding what you destroyed. Trust, cooperation, the basic social contracts that make civilization possible. By executing 200 provincial lords, by eliminating threats to stability before they metastasize. She corrected. You taught me that. Remove problems before they become catastrophic. I'm just applying your own philosophy. The words hit harder than any blade. Because she was right. She hadn't rejected his methods. She'd perfected them, taken the brutal efficiency he'd valued and wrapped it in language that made populations accept it. That's what evolution looked like. Not rejecting what came before. Refining it. You could have just killed me, Vaelor said quietly. At Ashmark. during the trial. Why drag this out? Because killing you makes you martyr, Seraphine said. I needed you broken first, discredited, turned into cautionary tale instead of legend. And now? Now you've escaped, made me look weak, forced me to demonstrate strength through whatever comes next. She moved away from the window, closer, still maintaining distance but no longer treating him as immediate threat. So here we are, she continued. You with blade and nothing to lose, me with empire and everything to protect. What happens next, Vaelor? That's up to you. Is it? Because it seems like you're the one who broke into my chambers. I wanted answers. Now I have them. And what will you do with those answers? Vaelor stood slowly, non-threatening, just shifting position. Leave, he said. Disappear. Let you rule without constant threat hanging over the empire. She studied him. Suspicious. You do that? Just walk away? If you make one promise, which is, stop the executions, all of them, the provincial lords, the suspected insurgents, everyone you're planning to eliminate in my name. He met her eyes directly. You won't make them martyrs either. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then, you're bargaining for their lives by offering mine. I'm offering you the clean victory you wanted. No martyrs, no legends. Just a king who disappeared into obscurity while you rebuild. Vaelor's voice stayed level. Take the deal. It's better than what comes if we keep fighting. And what comes if we keep fighting? One of us dies badly, the other rules over empire that never fully trusts them. Constant resistance, permanent instability. Until eventually someone else does to them what you did to me. She absorbed that. Understanding the brutal truth of it, cyclical violence, endless repetition, power changing hands but never becoming stable. Unless someone broke the cycle. How do I know you'll keep your word? She asked. You don't. Same way I don't know if you'll keep yours. Vaelor lowered the blade slightly, but we both know continuing this path destroys everything we're trying to protect. Silence stretched between them. Two brilliant minds calculating outcomes. Weighing trust against survival. Deciding whether collaboration was possible between people who'd spent months destroying each other. Finally, Seraphine spoke. If I agree, if I suspend the executions and let you vanish, you disappear completely. No insurgency, no underground resistance, no attempts to reclaim power. Agreed. And if you break that promise, I will hunt you to the end of the world and make your death last weeks. Fair. She extended her hand, not in friendship, in formal contract. Vaelor looked at it, at her, at the possibility of ending this without more bloodshed. Then the door exploded inward. Guards flooded the chamber, weapons raised, clearly having tracked him here, prepared to execute him on sight. But they stopped when they saw Seraphine standing calmly with her hand extended toward the wanted fugitive. Confusion rippled through their ranks. The captain in charge looked between them. My lady, we can... Stand down, Seraphine said calmly. The prisoner and I are negotiating. Negotiating? The captain looked horrified. He's a convicted traitor. Who is leaving peacefully under terms we're currently establishing? Seraphine's voice hardened. Unless you'd prefer to undermine my authority by questioning my decisions in front of subordinates? The captain went rigid. No, my lady, of course not. Then lower your weapons and wait outside. I'll call when I require assistance. The guards looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable, obviously thinking this was insane, but Seraphine's authority was absolute. They withdrew slowly, weapons still ready, leaving the door open, maintaining visual contact. Seraphine looked back at Vaelor, her hand still extended. We were discussing terms, she said, and in that moment, Vaelor understood. She'd just made her choice, publicly, in front of witnesses who would report every detail to the council within the hour. She'd chosen negotiation over execution, chosen to preserve his life despite having perfect justification and overwhelming force to end it. That was risk, political risk, personal risk, the kind that could undermine everything she'd built if it went wrong. But she'd taken it anyway, because somewhere beneath the manipulation and the performance, she actually wanted the cycle to end. Vaelor reached out. Their hands met. Contract made. But before either could speak, explosion, massive, catastrophic, shaking the entire citadel to its foundation. Stone cracked, windows shattered, The floor itself buckled as something detonated in the levels below, with enough force to be felt throughout the structure. Vaelor and Seraphine both went to the window. Below, the city was erupting into chaos. Fire spreading through multiple districts simultaneously, people fleeing, and in the distance, approaching through the smoke, an army. Not imperial forces, not provincial rebels, black armor, Mordrake's crest, thousands of soldiers moving with coordinated precision toward Blackthorn's gates. Luciani Mordrake had finally revealed himself, and he'd brought enough force to tear the entire capital apart. Seraphine's face went white. That's impossible. We had intelligence, scouts. How did... She stopped, understanding dawning. This was coordinated, planned to coincide with Vaelor's trial. While the council was focused on internal theater, Mordrake had positioned an invasion force. This wasn't opportunism. This was calculated assault designed to decapitate the Empire while its leadership was gathered in one location. Guards burst back into the chamber, Captain shouting over the chaos. "My lady, we need to evacuate." "No," Seraphine said. "We hold the citadel. Mobilize every available..." "You don't have the forces," Vaelor interrupted. He was still staring at Mordrake's army, calculating numbers, assessing siege equipment. "Half your military is scattered north hunting insurgents. What's left in the capital can't hold against that." "Then what do you suggest?" Her voice was tight, controlled panic. Vaelor turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something terrifying. Not fear, not surrender, absolute commitment to violence. "I suggest," he said quietly, "you give me command of whatever forces remain, and I'll show that warlord what happens when he attacks my city." "Your city? You surrendered." "This is still my empire," Vaelor corrected. "My design, my fortress. And nobody takes it while I'm still breathing." Seraphine stared at him, choosing, deciding, weighing trust against survival, against every political calculation that suggested accepting his help was insanity. Then she made her choice. "Commander," she said to the captain without breaking eye contact with Vaelor, "you will take orders from King Vaelor until this siege is resolved." The captain looked like she'd lost her mind. "My lady?" "That's an order," she snapped. "Execute it, or I'll find someone who will." The captain's jaw worked. Then, reluctantly, "Yes, my lady." Vaelor looked at Seraphine one final time. "This doesn't change what happens after. We're not allies, just people who want to survive the next few hours." "Agreed." "Then let's go to war." And together, former king and the woman who'd destroyed him, they turned toward the window where Mordrake's army was smashing through the city's outer defenses, bringing fire and death toward the citadel's walls. The real battle was about to begin. And everything that came before, the betrayal, the trial, the negotiations, all of it became irrelevant. Because survival doesn't care about politics. It cares about who's willing to pay the highest price. And both Vaelor and Seraphine were about to discover exactly how high that price could climb. The thing about war is that it doesn't care about your politics. It doesn't care who deserves to rule or who's been wronged or what complicated history brought you to this moment. War just cares about violence. About who can deliver it faster, harder, and with less hesitation than the opposition. Vaelor understood that in his bones, had understood it since the first battle he ever fought, when he was young enough to think combat had rules and old enough to survive. Learning it didn't. Now, standing on Blackthorn's walls, watching Mordrake's army tear through the capital's outer districts like a plague of iron and fire, he felt that understanding crystallize into something cold and absolute. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about revenge. This was about survival. Pure. Brutal. Stripped of every civilized pretense, humanity wrapped around the act of killing. And survival belonged to whoever was willing to become the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. Beside him, Seraphine stood rigid, watching her city burn. Not his city anymore. Hers. The empire she'd spent months carefully dismantling and rebuilding was being torn apart by forces she'd failed to anticipate. That had to taste like acid in her throat. All that patient manipulation, all those sophisticated political maneuvers, rendered completely irrelevant by someone who understood that power ultimately came down to who controlled the most effective violence. Mordrake's forces were 3,000 strong, professional. Equipped with siege weapons that shouldn't have made it within 50 miles of the capital without detection, moving with coordination that suggested months of planning. This wasn't opportunistic assault. This was coordinated destruction designed to eliminate Blackthorn's leadership in one catastrophic strike, while the Empire's military was scattered chasing insurgents. Seraphine had been so focused on dismantling Vaelor's legacy that she'd missed the real threat positioning itself for killing blow. Now they were both about to pay the cost. The captain approached, armor scorched from the initial explosions, face grim. Available forces total 800 soldiers. Half are garrison troops with minimal combat experience. The rest are ceremonial guard. Against 3,000, Vaelor said quietly. Not a question. Statement of fact. The captain nodded. We can hold the citadel for maybe 2 days if they commit to full siege. After that we die, Vaelor finished, unless we change the equation. How? Seraphine's voice was tight, controlled, but underneath ran current of desperation. We're outnumbered, outpositioned, half our command structure is scattered across the territories. Then we stop fighting their battle and start fighting ours. Vaelor turned from the walls. Mordrake expects siege. Expects us to fortify and wait for reinforcement. That's conventional warfare. We give him conventional response, we lose. So what's the alternative? We take the fight to him. Vaelor started moving toward the command center, Seraphine and the captain following. Mordrake's strength is numbers and equipment. His weakness is that he's operating in terrain he doesn't fully understand. This is my city, my fortress. Every structure, every street, every sightline was designed according to principles I established. You want to fight 3,000 soldiers in urban warfare, the captain said slowly, with 800 defenders. I want to turn the entire capital into weapon, Vaelor corrected. Make every building a potential ambush point, every street a kill box, force them to fight in conditions where superior numbers become liability instead of advantage. The captain looked at Seraphine. My lady, this is insane. She finished. Absolutely insane. Yes, Vaelor agreed. It's also the only move that gives us better than 10% survival odds. Conventional defense gets us slaughtered. This at least makes them pay for every inch. Silence as they weighed impossible choices. Then Seraphine made her decision. Do it, she said. Full authority. Whatever you need. The captain looked like he wanted to protest. But orders were orders. He saluted stiffly and moved to relay commands, leaving Vaelor and Seraphine alone in the corridor. They looked at each other, really looked, past the political maneuvering and the betrayals and all the complicated history. Just two people who'd built empires and watched them crumble and now were fighting to survive the ruins. This doesn't make us allies, Seraphine said quietly. No, Vaelor agreed. It just makes us people who want to live through the night. And after, if we survive, then we finish what we started before Mordrake interrupted. You rule. I disappear. Empire continues without me. She studied his face, searching for deception, for hidden agenda, found nothing but exhausted honesty. I don't trust you, she said. Good. Vaelor started walking toward the command center. Trust gets you killed. Survival instinct keeps you breathing. Use the right tool for the job. The transformation happened faster than anyone thought possible. Vaelor tore apart every conventional defensive strategy the garrison had prepared, abandoned static positions, redistributed forces into mobile units designed for hit-and-run attacks rather than sustained defense. He positioned archers on rooftops with orders to target officers and siege equipment operators. Placed small teams and buildings along major approach routes with instructions to collapse structures on advancing forces. Establish kill zones in intersections where Mordrake's numbers would compress into manageable targets. It was controlled chaos. Organized anarchy designed to turn the capital into meat grinder. Soldiers who'd spent careers training for conventional warfare struggled to adapt, but Vaelor didn't give them time to hesitate. Just kept moving, kept positioning, kept transforming defensive posture into something Mordrake wouldn't anticipate. Seraphine coordinated civilian evacuation, getting non-combatants into the citadel's reinforced interior where thick walls and limited access points provided actual protection. Organizing supply distribution, managing the 1,000 details that kept an empire functioning even while it burned. They worked in parallel, not quite together, not quite separate. Two commanders executing complementary strategies born from fundamentally different philosophies about power. His through violence and consequences, hers through organization and control. both necessary. Neither sufficient alone. That realization sat heavy between them even as they avoided acknowledging it. The first real engagement happened 3 hours after Mordrake breached the outer walls. His vanguard pushed through the merchant district, expecting scattered resistance. Light opposition easily crushed by superior firepower. Instead, they walked into precision ambush. Archers on rooftops dropped officers with headshots. Building facades collapsed on advancing columns. Small units emerged from side streets, hit supply wagons, and disappeared before reinforcements could respond. Within 30 minutes, Mordrake's vanguard had taken 40% casualties and gained exactly 0 strategic ground. They pulled back, regrouped, adjusted tactics. But the damage was done. Not just physical casualties, psychological impact, the realization that this wouldn't be easy conquest, that Blackthorn still had teeth, that whoever was coordinating defense understood warfare at level that matched or exceeded Mordrake's own strategic capability. Word spread through his army. Uncertainty replacing confidence, and uncertainty was resource. Vaelor watched from elevated position as Mordrake's forces repositioned, reading their movement patterns, identifying commanders, calculating next assault vector. Seraphine appeared beside him, covered in dust from collapsed ceiling, exhaustion carved into every line of her face. "It's working," she said quietly. "For now." Vaelor didn't take his eyes off the enemy positions. But Mordrake's not stupid. He'll adapt, switch to siege tactics, try to starve us out instead of taking losses in direct assault. How long can we hold? Depends. How much food and water did we get into the Citadel? Enough for maybe 10 days. 2 weeks if we ration brutally. Then that's our timeline. Vaelor finally looked at her. 2 weeks to either break the siege or die trying. What about reinforcements? The armies you sent north are 3 weeks away minimum, even if they received orders immediately and marched back at forced pace. Vaelor's voice stayed flat. We're alone. Seraphine absorbed that. All her careful planning, all the political maneuvering, all the sophisticated strategy that had successfully dismantled Vaelor's empire. None of it mattered when 3,000 soldiers were trying to kill you and reinforcements were too far away to help. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Vaelor waited. Mordrake didn't do this alone. Seraphine's voice dropped. Someone inside the council gave him access, intelligence, coordination, everything he needed to position forces without detection. You have proof? Communications. Intercepted 3 weeks ago. I've been tracking the source. She paused. It's Lord Casimir. The words landed like blade between ribs. Casimir. The advisor who'd orchestrated Vaelor's original exile, who'd stood beside Seraphine throughout her rise, who'd positioned himself as elder statesman providing continuity. He'd been feeding Mordrake information the entire time. Why? Vaelor asked. Power. Seraphine's expression was bitter. He realized I was consolidating control, that he'd be sidelined once I no longer needed council legitimacy. So he made arrangement with Mordrake. Help destroy me, get rewarded with position in whatever regime replaced mine. And you didn't eliminate him because I needed proof before moving against senior council member. Because I was trying to build legitimate governance instead of ruling through purges. Her voice hardened. Because I was trying to be better than you. How's that working out? The question hung between them. Not mocking. Just genuine curiosity about whether her methods had actually produced better outcomes. Seraphine looked away. Not well, she admitted. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. Then, where is he now? Casimir? Probably in the Citadel, sheltering with other council members. Get him. Seraphine met his eyes. What are you planning? Leverage, Vaelor said. If Casimir's been coordinating with Mordrake, he has communication channels. Access. Information we can use. You want to torture him for intelligence. I want to give him a choice. Vaelor's voice stayed level. Help us survive, or die with everyone else. That's more mercy than he showed either of us. She should have refused, should have insisted on maintaining legal protocols even during siege. Instead, she just nodded, because survival didn't care about principles, and they were rapidly running out of options. Well, they found Casimir in the council chambers, surrounded by terrified bureaucrats pretending the walls weren't shaking from siege bombardment. He looked up as Vaelor and Seraphine entered, expressions cycling through shock, fear, and desperate calculation. "King Vaelor," he said carefully, "I heard about your escape." "Save it," Vaelor interrupted. "We know about Mordrake, know about the coordination, know you've been feeding him intelligence for months." The room went silent. Other council members staring at Casimir, processing, understanding dawning across their faces. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't." Seraphine's voice cut like glass. "I have the communications, encrypted messages from your private channels, coordination timelines that match Mordrake's movements perfectly. You're guilty. The only question is what we do about it." Casimir stood slowly, drawing himself up, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "You have no right to accuse me. I am senior council member." "You're a traitor," Vaelor said flatly. "And in approximately 30 seconds, you're going to tell me how to contact Mordrake, or I'm going to throw you off this balcony and let his army watch you fall." He moved forward, not threatening, just closing distance with absolute certainty. Casimir backed up, fear replacing performance. "You can't—" "I can." Vaelor's voice dropped to something colder. "You forget I spent 10 years ruling this empire, built systems you're still using, established consequences you've been hiding behind. Now those consequences are coming for you." "Guards!" Casimir shouted. "Arrest this man!" But the guards didn't move. They'd heard the accusations, seen the evidence in Seraphine's bearing, made their calculations about which authority to follow, and chose survival over protocol. Casimir was alone, isolated, exposed, facing the two people he'd betrayed most directly. "Last chance," Vaelor said. "Communication channels, encryption methods, everything you've been using to coordinate with Mordrake. Why would I help you?" "Because otherwise you die right now," Seraphine said quietly, "and I promise your death will be memorable." Casimir looked between them, searching for mercy, for negotiation space, found nothing but cold certainty. Finally, he broke. "Encrypted courier system," he said. "Messages pass through civilian merchants. Mordrake has agent in the market district. Contact point disguised as spice trader." Vaelor absorbed that. "Can you send message?" "Yes," Casimir whispered. "Then here's what you're going to do." Vaelor leaned in close. "You're going to tell Mordrake that Blackthorn's leadership is fragmenting, that council is prepared to negotiate surrender, that he should send representative to discuss terms. That's suicide. He'll know it's trap. Maybe. Or maybe his arrogance makes him believe we're actually that desperate." Vaelor smiled coldly. "Either way, we get information, confirmation of intentions, possibly opportunity to eliminate command structure. You write the message, make it convincing, fail, and what happens next will make execution look merciful." Casimir sat at desk with trembling hands, began writing. Seraphine watched, expression unreadable. When the message was complete, Vaelor took it. Read carefully, checking for hidden warnings or coded language that might alert Mordrake. Satisfied, he handed it to guard. "Get this to the courier system. Make sure it reaches Mordrake within the hour." The guard left, leaving Casimir sitting there, having just betrayed his co-conspirator under duress, understanding that regardless of outcome, he was finished. "What happens to me now?" he asked quietly. "You survive," Vaelor said. "For now. After the siege, Seraphine decides your fate. But until then, your resource, asset to be used." He turned to leave. Seraphine followed. Outside, away from listening ears, she spoke quietly. "You know this won't work. Mordrake's too smart to fall for obvious trap." "Probably," Vaelor agreed, "but it forces response, makes him commit forces to investigating possibility, creates uncertainty in his command structure. And uncertainty is what we've been trading in since this started. You're gambling with all our lives. I've been gambling with all our lives since I escaped trial." Vaelor looked at her directly. "Difference is now we're gambling together. That makes the odds slightly less terrible." She absorbed that. Then, "I was wrong about you." Vaelor raised eyebrow. "I thought you were just brutal, just cruel for its own sake." Seraphine's voice was quiet. "But watching you work these last hours, you actually care. About the people, about the empire. You just express it through violence instead of words." "Violence is honest," Vaelor said. "Words can lie. Consequences can't." Is that really how you see the world? That's how the world is, whether I see it that way or not. They stood there in silence, two brilliant minds forged in different fires, reaching something approaching mutual understanding. Then alarm bells started ringing. Both of them ran toward the walls. Below, Mordrake's army was moving, but not attacking, withdrawing, pulling back from forward positions, consolidating forces, creating distance. What are they doing? Seraphine asked. Vaelor watched the patterns, reading tactical deployment, understanding dawning with sick certainty. They're preparing for bombardment, he said. Siege weapons, artillery. They're going to shell the citadel into rubble instead of taking casualties in direct assault. Can the walls hold against concentrated bombardment from that much equipment? Vaelor's voice was grim. Not indefinitely, maybe a day. 2 if we're fortunate. The timeline just compressed dramatically. What they'd hoped to stretch into 2 weeks of attrition warfare had become desperate race against structural collapse. Seraphine's face was pale. Then we've lost. Not yet. Vaelor was already moving, already calculating. We have 1 move left, which is, we go to him, directly. Before he can execute bombardment, Seraphine grabbed his arm. That's insane, you'll be walking into their army. Yes, but I'll be walking in as messenger, under flag of truce, to negotiate surrender terms. You said you'd never surrender? I said I'd never accept their version of surrender. Vaelor pulled free. But if I can get close enough to Mordrake to actually talk, I can figure out what he really wants. Whether this is conquest or something else. And if it's conquest, then I kill him, right there, in front of his entire army, cut the head off the snake and watch the body thrash. The audacity of it left her speechless. That's not strategy, she finally said. That's suicide with extra steps. Maybe. Vaelor's expression was hard. But it's the only move that changes the board state. Sitting here waiting for artillery to grind us down is guaranteed death. This at least has chance. Seraphine stared at him, processing, calculating odds, then making decision that probably sealed both their fates. I'm coming with you, she said. No. Yes. If this is negotiation, they need to see unified leadership, king and regent together. Otherwise, Mordrake knows it's just desperation play. Vaelor wanted to argue.